Professor Robert Eisenman, author of a number of books on the Dead Sea Scrolls, James, the brother of Jesus, Sea Scrolls and the First Christians, and books like that. And some of them are out from Penguin, some of them are out from other publishers and are still available. In fact, nothing drew me to it. I had been in the East Coast environment and also in Israel. I had gone to Ivy League universities. I had studied originally things like engineering, physics, and then philosophy and literature and things like that at Cornell. I originally thought I wanted to be a nuclear physicist and so on. And I suddenly realized that I didn't really like the sort of colleagues I was encountering in that line of activity. So I moved over into philosophy, and that was interesting, but rather dry. And finally, I got into literature. So I thought I was going to be a writer. And after college, I did what most writers think they're going to do. They go off into the world. In my view, since Paris was supposed to be the Bohemian writing center of the world, I took off as fast as I could to Paris on the left bank. That was in the late 50s. So I started traveling around, and Vienna had always appealed to me. I went into some people in Paris recommended I go into the Austrian Alps to do some writing. So I did, made a lot of good friends there. That wasn't enough for me. So I kept moving to Turkey and Istanbul and Athens and so on. I was going to go to a Greek island. So I went to Idra, because it was the closest to the Greek mainland. Still trying to do some writing. And I went back to Europe and Paris and hung out in those kinds of places, went to kibbutzim in Israel, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I went to NYU in a course called Hebrew and Near East Studies. And I originally got a scholarship in Hebrew. Then when I wanted to do a doctorate, I went to Columbia, and I didn't have any in Hebrew. I got one in Arabic. I went to Columbia for my doctorate in Middle East languages and cultures. And I did a dissertation on Islamic law. So I said, well, I want to go back to Israel. So I wrote a dissertation so I could get fellowship aid on Islamic law in Mandate Palestine and modern Israel. That's now published from E.J. Brill in Leiden. So I did my work, as you see, in Islamic studies. I had a background in, Hebraic, Bible, all these other things from my earlier interests on the kibbutz family when I was reading these things privately, but I never really formally studied them that much. General survey courses. So after I finished my doctorate, which took me 5 years to write and so on, at that time, jobs were freezing up in America, and there weren't a lot of jobs going. And I was offered a job at a place called Cal State Long Beach in the religious studies department as a course to be able to teach a good course, Islamic law. Well, no one was going to take a course in Islamic law. I didn't realize at the time that you had to fill the courses up. Jerry Brown was governor actually at that time still. And, he had made, you had to have a minimum number of bodies in the course for it to go. So if you didn't fill it, it didn't go. So I had to start teaching courses that would go. And that meant people were interested in Christianity. That's what people were interested in, Jesus, the Bible. Courses like that would go. If you get an now you could get an Islamic civilization course to go, but back then, they wouldn't even know what it was. So one course that was on the book was intertestament literature. Well, who's going to take a course in intertestament literature? They wouldn't even know what it was. So I changed the title because I'd taken a Dead Sea Scrolls course for my master's at NYU in Hebrew and Near East Studies, Dead Sea Scrolls. So I changed it to Dead Sea Scrolls. I thought that was a catchy title, and people started registering. And I had to teach it every single term. Now, people at Harvard, Yale, Princeton, you name it, those kind of universities, they teach 1 or 2, even 3 courses, maybe a year. We had to teach 4 courses a term. It was mandated by state law. You had to get these courses to go. So that was bad and good, because those chaps, as decent scholars as they are, don't really have to do a lot of teaching, therefore they don't learn a lot outside of their main field. I had to teach, and in teaching you learn. And that's what happened to me. I began to know the Dead Sea Scrolls because I had the whole collections of them backwards and forwards. I began to know the New Testament backwards. I had to teach a New Testament course. I invented a course called Paul and James because I discovered who they were by reading these courses. I didn't even know there was a guy called James when I started, and when I was reading the book of Acts, it jumped out at me. Who is this person, particularly in the we portion of Acts, the later portion, he becomes very important. And you realize he's the leader of the early church if you read it carefully. And then Paul is in conflict with him. And who would have known that? I wouldn't have known that. You won't teach it, you learn it at graduate school. You only learn it through teaching, reading the text over and over and over again. Well, this is how I got into the fields which I got into. And then I started writing in those fields, and all the rest is history. So that's how I got into these fields. I started writing on the Dead Sea Scrolls. From the Dead Sea Scrolls, I wrote about early Christianity. From early Christianity, I got into the issues of what kind of Christianity we're talking about: Palestinian Christianity, overseas Christianity, Pauline Christianity, Romanized Christianity, or Dead Sea Scrolls style Christianity. Well, I think Christianity, you see, is a name based on a Greek word, Christ. So it's nothing to do with Palestine per se, but they're trying to translate in some manner a concept they don't really understand, the Messiah.
When you say they, I know it's the general term.
The people who are working in the Greek language to present this to the Greco-Roman world, they're trying to find words that will reproduce a concept in the Hebrew language and in the scrolls or in the Bible that we're calling Messiah, Moshiach, whatever word you want to apply. And so the closest they could get was this, I don't know where they got it, frankly, this Christus or Crestus at one point someone uses anyway. So the minute you're talking about Christ, Crestus, Christianity, you're talking about a Greco-Roman sort of production, a Hellenized a piece of material aimed at a Greco-Roman world. So that's where you get that form from in that kind of enclave. But as I discovered, that did not reflect what I later started calling Palestinian Christianity. And I didn't even like the term Palestinian Christianity because I don't think it was Christianity in Palestine. That's a Greek term. It's really Palestinian Messianism. Palestinian Messianism. And what I discovered in doing the scrolls more and more was that other people who were working on the scrolls but being Christians themselves couldn't see any connection of the scrolls to Christianity because the Christianity they knew was nothing like the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Christianity they know is love, turn the other cheek, otherworldly, etc., peaceful, and so on. The scrolls are nothing like that. And even though they want to try to call the scrolls Essenes, they're not Essenes in the normal sense of the word Essenes because the scrolls are apocalyptic. They are full of anger. They don't love their enemy. They hate their enemy. They say, hate the sons of the pit. Now, if you have a document that says, hate the sons of the pit, how can you compare it or even turn it into something that says, love your enemy? So the love your enemy is very attractive. I'm not saying it isn't attractive, but it doesn't reflect Palestinian Messianism. It reflects Greco-Roman Christianity. So the Christ we get pictured in the Gospels, as we call them, as they've come to be called, to my mind, as I learn more and more about these things, is highly Paulinized. Because Paul was someone who was familiar with the Greco-Roman world. He seems to have been either born there or come out of there. He says he's from Tarsus, which his family seems to have lived in southern Anatolia, today's Turkey, which was Hellenistic at that time. But I don't think that he actually is in origin from those areas. I came to appreciate it, and this is where you get really deep into history. And most of the scholars of the scrolls, they're not interested in any of this. They don't go anywhere except, is this word correct? Is that word correct? The paleography, the handwriting, this, that. They don't know they're covering anything up. They don't recognize anything here as familiar to them in the Christianity that they know. But they don't know that the Christianity that they know was actually a Greco-Roman production that had very little to do with what was going on in Palestine at the time. Well, these are historical insights you're talking about. I was speaking more generally first. I didn't want to get into the specific historical points that you're raising yet. I just wanted to talk about the mindset of the people working on the scrolls, why they couldn't come to terms with these materials, and how their prior belief systems or familiar belief appreciations, whether they believers or not, influence their perception of the scrolls. So what they felt that basically they were trying to say that the scrolls weren't Christian because, as I was telling you, you can't have a document that says hate the sons of the pit, that is preaching a final apocalyptic war against all evil on the earth, and so that thinks the holy angels are warrior angels, that thinks that they have to be totally pure, because if they are not totally pure, they're not unsophisticated people, and they're not simplistic, that they think that they don't have enough power to deal with the might of the Roman Empire. They need the holy angels, who are warrior angels, to join their camps, as they call them, where they're living, in order to defeat the might of Rome. They want to defeat the might of Rome. Now, this is not Christianity as we know it. This is Messianism in Palestine, but this is not, because these hordes, these hosts, shall we say, of warrior holy angels, and the men of the scroll community are going to be led by the Messiah in this final apocalyptic war against all evil on the earth. So what is supposed to happen in their view, and this is in the war scroll, we call it, the war of the sons of light against the sons of darkness. Nobody who is a believing Christian could say this is a Christian document. They just wouldn't recognize it as such, but it's a messianic document. And that's what I tried to begin to clarify. I didn't know it either. But as I taught this material, and I began to read through it, and I knew the establishment reigning theories of scroll studies, I began to see that these did not fit the picture of the materials that I was teaching in my classes. So what I was finding is in the scrolls, and it's fairly consistently so, the scrolls are really pretty consistent. They don't have a document that is opposing another document. The whole mindset is more or less the same across the spectrum of the newer documents, we call them, the more recently revealed documents. That you don't have, these are very consistent documents, and they're a very aggressive apocalyptic messianism. So I started calling this the messianic movement in Palestine. I even went further, and this is more recently, as I got more, I hate to say sophisticated, but I think I got sophisticated. since the documents of the scrolls were speaking about the sons of Zadok. See, Zadok was the high priest in David's time. So they meant by this priestly in some way. Zadok also can translate into Hebrew ZDK as righteousness, Zedek. So they were playing around with these concepts, playing on words, righteousness, priesthood, high priesthood, and so on. Since the group in Josephus, the historian of the period, that is supposed to represent the priesthood are called the Sadducees, coming from the word Zadok, and you can see that the Sadducees in the New Testament are supposed to be the priestly class, right? The only problem is we have here a huge problem. The Sadducees in the New Testament, or the Gospel, shall we say, the pictures that we have there, are collaborating Sadducees. Sadducees collaborating with the Herodian upper class monarchy imposed upon Palestine by the Roman Empire and the Roman army and the Roman troops. So King Herod came into power with the defeat of the Maccabees, the ones that the Jews celebrate Hanukkah for, the defeat of the Maccabees in the 40s to 30s BC. The Maccabees had taken over sometime in the 60s, 70s, 80s BC period. The wars went on then. So by that time, the Herodian family which was not even a Palestinian, not even a Jewish family, actually came from Gaza partially, and partially across into Edom, Petra. It was a mixture of that background, but it became Judaized in order that they could become kings in Palestine. So Herod himself was one of these people, and he was converted to, quote, Judaism. But this was nothing like the Dead Sea Scrolls Judaism. It was a Pharisee kind of Judaism. That's why most people think of Judaism as Pharisee Judaism. And the New Testament thinks of Judaism as Pharisee Judaism. And the Sadducees are the high priests. Aha! But they're not all the high priests. There's opposition high priests. And that's what we see. This is really, when you start to do this, looking deeper into the meaning and substance of the scrolls. Now, the academic curia or establishment that was in control of the scrolls was more interested in translating the documents and didn't really come to terms with the meaning of the documents themselves. So when they saw the term sons of Zadok there, it didn't ring a bell to them that these could be Sadducees. How could these documents be Sadducees? No. These are Essenes. These are not Sadducees. But you see, because look, their attitudes don't look like Sadducees in Josephus, Sadducees in the New Testament. What are these? They're opposition Sadducees. They're Sadducees following the Maccabees, who were thrown out of power and went into exile and so on and so forth. But they do claim Zadokite, Sadducee descent, but they are an aggressive, anti-Roman, anti-Herodian, anti-establishment, pro-temple form of Sadduceeism. So I started calling these, people thought I was crazy, but I don't think I'm crazy, Messianic Sadducees. Messianic, I mean, what? Messianic, how can you have Sadducees who are, Sadducees are collaborators, they're establishment party, they're this, they're that, they're no good, they persecute Christians, they throw Jesus into prison, etc., 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 etc. Yes, but not the Sadducees we're talking about out in the wilderness, out in the Dead Sea Scrolls, waiting for the army of holy angels. Not the Sadducees who wrote the documents that we now have, which are in fact the Messianic movement of Palestine. That's how I came up with all these things.
I love it. I'm going to give a camera break here real quick.
Sure, I need a break.
The interesting piece is that if it's a quote from him and it's making reference from a quote from the scrolls, that means, in my opinion, Jesus or Yeshua was very familiar with what was in the scrolls.
Well, look, the problem with Jesus, a Greek name, if we can call him Joshua, Yeshua, whatever, I don't even know what he might have been called in Palestine if he had a everyday street name as such. because Yeshua is a very meaningful name, meaning savior, he who saves. So it's a little bit, or a second Joshua, if you want. So he may have been called that, and I don't say he wasn't. But the point of the matter is, we don't have any documentation about him except this material coming through the Gospels or spin-offs of the Gospels. So that is a whole literature. The Gospels, the pseudo-Gospels, the rejected Gospels, the extra Gospels, the Gnostic Gospels, or this Gospel, so that. There's a vast literature explosion in that area. That's the data, but that's not necessarily historical. And it may have been based on some original activity that was literary done in some places, because we have no Hebrew originals. There are some Aramaic type Gospels, but I think they're taken from the Greek. In any case, I don't even think there's an Aramaic original. I think the originals are in Greek. I may be wrong, but that would be an argument scholars would have to pound out with each other over decades, generations, and they probably would never agree anyway. I've tried to emphasize something that comes through very, very strongly in the more autobiographical sections of what is generally referred to as the New Testament. That is, the Paul's letters that are mostly the ones that people agree on authentic. People think that they're authentic. I don't think all of them are authentic, and I don't make these judgments myself, because I'm not able to say, except through internal data, what's authentic and what isn't authentic. But there are some letters that people agree on are fairly authentic. And there's some material in the book of Acts that is fairly historical, not of the kind of the Gospels. So if you look at the book of Acts, and this is where a believing Christian can actually make these determinations for themselves, his or herself, you notice that the first 15 chapters or so of Acts it's considered written by the same writer who wrote the Gospel of Luke. And Luke seems to be a traveling companion of Paul in Acts. And also in Galatians, he's referred to, he seems to be some problem there with Luke in Galatians. In any case, somewhere around chapter 15, up to that point, the material resembles the Gospels in its tone, texture, and outlook. But after chapter 15, it completely changes, because the narrative goes from a third-person narrative, he, they, did something, she, to a first-person narrative, I, we. And that's really startling. And we call that the we document, because it actually looks like an authentic travel document, a diario, if you want, written by someone. I did this, we did that, I did that, we did that. If you remember, by the time you get to Acts 21, it's saying, Paul and we went up to Jerusalem, and so on and so forth, and so it's pretty autobiographical at that point, but from a Pauline standpoint. It's not autobiographical about, let's say, Peter. It's not autobiographical, let's say, James. It's from someone who's with Paul, Luke, let us say. And it's first-person narrative, we, first-person plural. And there's, to my mind, historical material there. And I can give you an example. Acts 21:21, James speaking. Earlier, we didn't even know who James was. Acts never introduced this James. It did have a James, but he's James, the brother of John. He's not the James talking in Acts 21:21. He's someone who goes off to Spain, perhaps, or someplace, and evaporates, disappears. killed or whatever it is, he's someone's brother, you see, and that's why you have to have a little bit of suspicion about the earlier version if he's being written out and changed into a different character. Because as long as he's the brother of someone, then instead of the brother of Jesus, he may be being called the brother of John. But in any case, he disappears. And we don't get a James as a leader of the church, until Peter is supposed to be the leader of the church. Peter is supposed to be the rock upon which I build my church. This is all in the Gospels. But you see, in the autobiographical narrative parts of this literature, it turns out that Peter is not the leader of the church. That's what struck me very strongly as I was doing that teaching, and ultimately, well, I hate to say blew my mind, but it did explode within my mind that we have a different picture of what was going on here in these narrative portions of the literature that are more reliable than the, shall we say, more literary portions of the literature. So at this point, the we documents, but you see, Paul, we are all, meaning we are all zealots for the law. Well, that just would bang you right in the face. It's in Acts. It's in the we portion of Acts. When you see a line like that you know is historical because no one could have created out of the blue, then you know there's a lot of non-historical material that has been created in all these other compositions. And just that line alone should blow your mind. But you see, Paul, we are all zealots for the law. Well, we didn't know early Christians were zealots for the law. We never heard that. Paul's no zealot for the law. Paul makes us think that the law brings a curse. The law brings death. Jesus brings life. I mean, all of his letters are arguing against the law so powerfully that we as Christians, or we who think we're Christians, I'm not one of those, but the one, I'm speaking like that, think that the law is something negative, and here James, the leader of the church, is saying we are all not only for the law, we are zealots for the law. And we see, Paul, that, you don't go into the temple. And we have some men here who are under Nazirite oath. That's a very particular form of the law. And they need, and they have to go into the temple to purify themselves, and they have to pay some expenses. So we would like you, because we know you have a lot of money. You've come from overseas. You've been raising money. You please go into the temple with some of your colleagues there and pay for some of these people we have there under Nazirite oath. And Paul, nothing loath, says, sure, I will do that. I will do that. We know that he despises the temple, that he despises Nazirite oath, that he despises the law, and yet we see what kind of a character he is. That's why I'm not a big fan of Paul, because Paul, to my mind, is very, how shall we put it, flexible. Not only flexible, he is not a person of principle. He runs the race to win, as he says in one of his letters. I believe in winning, not beating the air. I think that's in either 1 Corinthians, I think that's in 1 Corinthians or Romans. And that expresses his mentality. Well, we're all the runners at the stadium are running for the prize. I believe in running for the final prize. I believe in winning, not beating the air. It uses the imagery of Roman stadium athletics. That would never happen in the scrolls. That would never happen in Palestine. That would only happen in a Hellenized mindset. So what I have tried to show from the letter to the Romans, that Paul is not just someone from Tarsus. It's very important. He's not just someone from Tarsus, because at the end of Romans, and I credit those greetings, he sends greetings to some members of the Herodian family who have been exiled because of the Jewish war that Josephus writes about at the time he's writing these things, to Rome. And, he says, send my regards to my kinsman Herodion in Rome. His kinsman Herodion. Herodion means the littlest Herod, the youngest Herod, his kinsman. So it came to me, my mind, And that's how I started developing these essays and points that I have, that Paul is actually from the Herodian family. Now, the Herodian family were seen as very good rulers by the Romans, and they had little kingdoms given them in northern Syria and in Asia Minor. That's why he comes from Tarsus, because whoever were his family there probably did rule a Roman province in southern Anatolia.
So with that, perfect.
And that, by the way, and that's why he has a Roman citizenship, because the Herodians were given Roman citizenship. This is where my details begin to lose me. I think all the way back in Pompey's time, when they made them kings in Palestine. Oh, absolutely. Why was he executed? Oh, with the Gospels, he's executed because the Romans had made a mistake, and the Jews plotted against him. Well, all that is just hocus, to my mind, hocus. I hate to say that. You know, the Romans, Pontius Pilate didn't make mistakes. He crucified more, we know from Josephus, he crucified more people than just about any other Roman governor. He knew exactly who he was crucifying and why, and wanted to. And I don't think if it's true that he crucified Jesus, that there was any mistake whatsoever made, and the Jews didn't pull the wool over his eyes. So these are things I disagree with the Gospels about. Now, the moment you start disagreeing with the Gospels, then you're hurting Christians' feelings. Then you're hurting their religious beliefs, because these things have become over 20 centuries sacrosanct. No, who's ever questioned these things? Nobody in their right mind has ever questioned these things. Maybe some people were burnt in the Middle Ages who questioned such things, but no one with any historical knowledge has ever questioned such things. So people have just taken these things as absolute truth. But as I say in my work, ultimately, these are the products of literature. And to my mind, literature is a very facile form of history. In other words, it's much easier to form a belief about literature because it can be formed and structured in a certain way. And it's easy to remember. I mean, I remember the Iliad, I remember the Odyssey, but I don't remember all the Greek history concerning Alexander the Great and all the different political plots in Athens and in Sparta and all these things. And everything in Palestine would be almost too complicated. If you read Josephus, he's written 2 huge works, the Jewish War and the Antiquities about this. The Antiquities is like 1,000 pages. And, you know, to pass through all that material would be mind-boggling. So the Gospels are 3 or 4 variations on basically the same theme, and they're very easy to digest, and they're easy to enjoy, and they have some concepts in them that are very attractive. So people do find themselves feeling very close to them. But if you want to start getting into, is this an accurate picture of what occurred in Palestine in the 1st century, then there are people like me who say, oh, hold on a moment. That may be an accurate picture of what some people painted in Rome and Alexandria, but that may not be exactly what occurred in Palestine. And then, bam, the Dead Sea Scrolls are discovered in the 1880, 1890s or 1947, but some came in earlier. The Zadokite document was discovered in Cairo in the Gnaeus in the 1890s and so on, and you began to see other kinds of documents coming, other kinds of messianic documents. And then we did get the caves during the Arab-Israeli War of 47, 48. And once we got all these documents out, which is why I was so anxious in the 80s to fight the campaign that everyone should see all of the documents. Once we could see all of the documents, see how consistent they were, see how messianic they were, then we could see that we had an opposition messianic movement in Palestine that had a complete literature that had been totally inverted and reversed in the Gospels. So the Gospels are good. I have nothing wrong with them. They're beautiful literature. The ideals enunciated are wonderful. But I don't say the scroll. I'm not a believer in the scrolls. I don't say the scrolls are the most marvelous documents in the universe. But they are not what was occurring in Palestine. They are a Hellenized, Romanized version of, they're a Greco-Roman version of what the Romans felt comfortable with. That is, Roman centurions are pictured as recognizing the Messiah before Jews do. you know, love your enemies, don't make war against the Roman Empire, you know, and so on and so forth. All this is very convenient to help these documents survive in a Roman imperial framework, which is what they do, and ultimately dominate the Roman Empire by the 300-400s. So my only argument, I don't argue with the beauty of these documents. My only argument is the historicity. So my whole thing has been from the beginning that one is literature and the other is history. You want to just do literature, fine. If you want to do history, then you have to go to the Dead Sea Scrolls. And if you go to, you may not love them, but if you want to go to the Dead Sea Scrolls, you'll get a more accurate picture of the historical Jesus than you will from the Gospels. Why? Well, first they'll explain his execution, absolutely, not in the explanation you get in the Gospels, which is, to my mind, contrived, because as I just said earlier, Pontius Pilate didn't hesitate to crucify anybody, and he didn't have Jews convincing him of who to crucify. And but the other thing is that these scrolls give you a picture of what the Jamesian community probably looked like. I mean, we have this character that pops up in early church literature and we don't understand it. Everywhere we hear about Eusebius in the 4th century, Hippolytus in the 2nd or 3rd, Jerome in the 5th, we start hearing about this person called James the Just. Well, who is James the Just? James Justus, Justus, that's Latin. It goes back to dikaios in Greek, righteous, and Zadik in Hebrew. James the Tzaddik. James the Tzaddik. Ah, when I go to the Dead Sea Scrolls, I can find out who the Tzaddik was, because the scrolls are all centered around the idea of Zadokite, Zedek, righteousness, Zadik. And their leader is known as the teacher of righteousness, the More HaTzedek. And where do they get the More HaTzedek from? The teacher of righteousness. They take biblical passages, and everywhere the word Zadik appears that is convenient for them, they interpret in terms of something the teacher of righteousness was doing. So in the text, he's the Tzaddik. In the interpretation of the text, he's the teacher of righteousness. And what is James? The teacher of righteousness in the Christian literature. And so this began to gel for me. Oh, and by the way, one last thing. As I said at the end of my James book, who and whatever James was, it had to be, so was Jesus. Because just like, and I'm not a great Kennedy admirer. I don't like people who are shot in a miserable, violent, brutal manner. I don't like that kind of thing, but I didn't necessarily love him. I worked on his campaign, but I find some things that he were not attractive ultimately to me. But I don't think that his brothers differed ideologically to any extent. Bobby didn't differ, the other brother didn't differ that much. And I don't think James and Jesus would have differed that much from each other. I don't think that's the way things happen. Yeah, the Gospel of Thomas, all those Gospels.
All right, peace and blessings, peace and blessings. Let's go ahead and get this show on the road. All right. Peace and blessings. Let's get this show on the road. That was all right, peace and blessings, That was actually Dr. Robert Eisman, right? I actually have his book. You guys can see that because of the background AI, but I actually have his book. It's called James, the Brother of Jesus by Robert Eisman. You guys can get it off Amazon. The best scholar on the Dead Sea Scrolls in James, the Brother of Jesus. Like he told you in there that he used to be a teacher, a scholar, Islam, Christianity, and when he came across the Dead Sea Scrolls, changed his mind, realized it wasn't a Christian document. So I'm going to actually help you guys actually understand what he's saying, right? this off. So I'm actually going to help you guys actually understand what he's saying by using scripture, by using history, Josephus, you know, things that surround it. I've been following these things going on 7 years, all praises. I actually have a document typed up. Let me see. There we go. Good. I have a document typed up. Hope you guys enjoy this. All right. Let's go ahead and get this show started now. All right. Really hope you guys enjoy this. All righty. Cool. All right. So, when we talk about a Christian document, right? Let's talk about Titus chapter 3, verse 1, right? Okay. I'll blow it up so y'all can see it, right? When we talk about a Christian document, Titus chapter 3, verse 1, remind the people to be subject to rulers and authority, to be disobedient, to be ready to do whatever is good, to slander no one, to be peaceable and considerate, and always be gentle, right? This will be a Christian document, right? Like Robert Eisman is saying, the Dead Sea Scrolls material is not a material that would submit to governing authorities, right, and rulers. And they were prepared or getting prepared for this type of authority that wanted to govern over them, which they would not submit to, right? So when we read verses like Romans 13, right, let everyone be subject to governing authorities, for their authority is no authority except that which God established, the authorities. The authorities that exist have been established by God. Consequently, who rebels against the authority is rebelling against the God has instituted, and those who do so will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers hold no terror for those who do right, but for those who do wrong. Do you want to be free from fear of the one in authority? Then do what is right, and you will be commended. For the one in authority is God's reason. They are God's servants, agent of wrath to bring punishment on the wrongdoer. Therefore, it is necessary to submit to the authorities, not only because of possible punishment, but also as a matter of conscience, right? So notice what it says, right? It says that that the authority that is given by God, right, at this time, right, will be Nero. So this Nero, right, would be a servant of God, according to Paul. This Nero is an agent of wrath to bring punishment on wrongdoers, right? Therefore, it is necessary to submit to the authorities, not only because of possible punishment, but also as a matter of conscience, right? Here's where that works both ways, right? Nero's punishment, right, was for the sins of Israel. But Nero's punishment is to go as far as destroying the temple. Because remember, the Essenes believed that the temples were defiled, right? And that goes back to Daniel 9, where it talks about the desolation, right? The abomination, the desolation of the temple. This would be in regards to Nero, right? And so again, Paul is saying that Nero, right, is God's agent. And again, this is wrath being brought upon us. So we need to submit to Nero, right? So the Essenes, this Dead Sea Scrolls documents, right? They are not a group that would submit to Nero, right? They are a group that would not submit to Paul in regards to scriptures like this, right? And so we'll keep reading. This is also why, now this is the major thing, right? Verse 6. Verse 6 says, this is why you pay taxes for the authorities or guide servants who give their full time to governing, right? It says, give to everyone what you owe them. If you owe taxes, pay taxes. If revenue, then revenue. If respect, then respect. If honor, then honor, right? And so this would be another thing like Robert Eisman said, right? This would not fit the Dead Sea Scrolls. This would not fit the Essenes' nature, right? Or the historical Jesus, right? But the gospel Jesus would portray this, right? Where, you know, this would be something that the gospel Jesus, the literature would say, right? Because remember, Jesus said to give unto Caesar what is Caesar, right? So you could parallel with that, with Paul is saying in Romans chapter 13 and 6, give to everyone what you owe them, right? If you owe taxes, pay taxes. If revenue, then revenue. If respect, then respect, right? This is more so of the Roman law, right? This is not the law of God, right? And so notice again, it said, if you pay taxes. So there are scriptures I was going to put in here, but you can see scriptures of people paying tithes in earlier stages. You see scriptures where I believe Abraham gives a certain tithe to Melchizedek after a war or something like that, if that account is true. But that wasn't done by force of God, but it was just something done willingly. But here, what we're talking here is the beginning, the start in the beginning of, like I said, the Jewish war, the temple destruction, and the Roman revolt, right? And so the Christian document does not paint a Jewish revolt, a Roman revolt, or the Jews revolting against the Roman. The literature does not paint that, right? And so again, this is where the Dead Sea Scrolls actually paint this, right? And so those very scriptures that I read from the beginning would be actually, the Essenes will be very anti-Pauline with that, right? So now I'm going to go into somewhere in Acts chapter 5 and 37, where we talk about Judas the Galilean. Now remember, Judas the Galilean withdrew people away from paying taxes, right? Acts chapter 5 and 37. After this man rose up, Judas of Galilee, in the days of taxing, and withdrew away much people after him, he also perished, and all, even as many as obeyed him, were dispersed, right? Now, here's the thing about that. But now remember where Robert Eisman talked about how the scriptures are literature, right? And how when we talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls and things like Josephus are more historical. Well, what I gave you was basic literature, right? Because it didn't really give you anything about this Judas the Galilean. And I'm pretty sure if they did, you know, the Gospels wouldn't seem so literature, right? So I'm going to go into Josephus, where he goes a little depth into who Judas the Galilean was, right? And so this is Antiquities of the Jews, chapter 18, right? Concerning the intervals of 32 years from the banishment of Archelaus to the departure of the Jews from Babylon. This is chapter 1, right? This is what it says. How Cyrenius was sent by Caesar to make a taxation of Syria and Judea, and how Coponius was sent to Procurator of Judea concerning Judas of Galilee, and concerning the sects that were amongst the Jews, right? It says, but the fourth sect of the Jewish philosophy, Judas the Galilean, was the author. These men agree on all other things which the Pharisaic notions, excuse me, but they have an inviolable attachment to liberty, right? A viable attachment to liberty, meaning they love freedom, right? They love their freedom so much that they're willing to go as far as to not even pay taxes to Rome, Nero, no matter how disgusting they are, right? And so it's, nor indeed do they heed the depths of their relations and friends, nor can any such fear make them call any man Lord, right? And since the immovable resolution of theirs is well known to a great many, I shall speak no more further about the matter, nor am I afraid that anything I have said of them should be disbelieved, rather fear that what I have said is beneath the resolution they show when they undergo pain. And it was in Gessius Florus time that the notion began to grow and with a distempter who was a procurator, and who occasioned the Jews to go wild with it by the abuse of this authority and to make them revolt from the Romans. And these are the sects of the Jewish philosophy. So as you can see, right, this is what Dr. Robert Eisman is talking about, where the literature is really there to stray you away, again, from a, a Roman revolt, right? The Gospels are not to portray a Roman revolt. This is why you have verses in in Timothy and Romans 13, what I just read, where the Gospels want you to submit to Nero, right? They want you to submit to Rome, right? Because these are the agents of God, and they are here, to punish us, right? And so necessarily understand, when it comes to God, punishment is not for you to stay in punishment, and neither is it for you to submit to punishment. But punishment is for you to do is for you to awaken the soul and realize why the suffering is upon you, and realize suffering comes through sin. And once you stop sinning, then suffering is lifted up, right? And so it makes it seem as if God wants us to continue in this suffering, as if God wants us to continue under the rulership of Romans, right? So let's keep going, right? I believe this is another verse concerning Judas the Galilean. Of the war, book 2, containing the interneval from the death of Herod to Vespasian, who was sent to subdue the Jews by Nero, right? Archelaus, Ethnarchy is reduced into Roman providence, the sedition of Judas of Galilee, the three sects of the Jews. It says, chapter 8. It says, and now Archelaus, part of Judea, was reduced into province, and Coponius, one of the equestrians, order amongst the Romans, was sent as procurator, having the power of life and death put into his hands by Caesar. Under his administration, it was that a certain Galilean, whose name was Judas, prevailed with a countryman to revolt, and said they were cowards if they would endure to pay tax to the Romans, and would after God submit to mortal men as their lords. This man was a teacher of a peculiar sect of his own, and was not at all of the rest those of their leaders, right? So now you have Judas the Galilean of the sect of the Galileans, who was saying on one side, right, that paying taxes to Rome is bad, right? And not only is that bad, that we should not submit unto mortal men. Now, I would allow the audience to make that decision by themselves, right? And so I would agree with Judas the Galilean on this, right? On this as well, right? That we are all supposed to be free men, and that we are not supposed to submit to no mortal man, right? So it says this man was a teacher of a peculiar sect of his own, and was not at all like the rest, right? What I also would like to do is, I would also like to second witness that also with scripture real fast. I will put this inside the text, because James also says this, right? In his literature. So James will be also anti Romans 13 and Titus with this, and I'll read it. James chapter 4 and 12 says, there is one lawgiver who is able to save and able to destroy. Who art thou that judges another, right? So James chapter 4 and 12 will be so anti Romans 13 and Titus, right? And there are other scriptures that tell you to submit to Rome in the New Testament as we continue on. So James 4 and 12 says, there is one lawgiver who is able to save and to destroy. Who art thou to judge, right? And so remember, Nero comes as a lawgiver, right? And we read yesterday how Nero would destroy anyone who basically disagreed with him. Okay, and this is also the character of Paul or Saul, right? As we read. Now, what it says right here is, this is book 2, containing the intervener of the 69 years from the death of Herod. Okay, so we read that already. I guess it kind of jumped back up, so let's go back down. No, that's actually right. Let's see where we at. Now it says, from the death of Herod to the Vespasian, right, was sent to subdue the Jews by Nero, how the war of the Jews with the Romans began and concerning Mayhem. Here we go. Now it says, in the meantime, one Mayhem, the son of Judas, was called the Galilean, who was very cunning and sophister, and had formerly reproached the Jews under Cyrenius that after God, right, they were subject to the Romans, took some of the men of note with him and retired to Masada, where he broke open King Herod's armory and gave arms, not only to his own people, but to other robbers also. These he made use of for a guard and returned in the state of the king to Jerusalem. He became the leader of the sedition and gave orders for continuing the siege. But they wanted proper instruments, and it was not practicable to undermine the wall, because the darts came down upon them from above. But still they dug a mine from a great distance under one of the towers and made it totter, right? And having done that, they set fire on the cumustole and left it. And when the foundations were burnt below, the tower fell down suddenly. Yet did they then meet with another wall that had been built within. For the besieged were sensible beforehand of what they were doing, and probably the tower shook it as undermining. So they provided themselves of another fortification, which then the besiegers unexpectedly saw. While they thought they had already gained the place, they were under some consternation. However, right, let me go down. However, those that were within sent to Menham and to the other leaders of the sedition and desired that they might go out upon the capitulation. This was granted to the king's soldiers and their own countrymen only, who went out accordingly. But the Romans that were left alone were greatly dejected, for they were not able to force their way through such a multitude, and to desire them to give them their right hand with the security. They thought it would be a reproach to them, and besides, if they should give it to them, they durst not depend upon it, so they deserted their camp and easily taken, and ran away to the royal tiles called Apicus, that's called Salius, and that's called Miriam. But Manham and his party fell upon the place whence the soldiers were fled, and slew as many of them as they could catch before they got up to the towers, and plundered that they left behind them, and set fire to the camp. This is executed on the 6th day of the month of Gorpius, right? So what you guys got to understand is what you're reading is what the literature of the New Testament has left out, right? And so the literature of the New Testament, like I've always been saying, right, for the last couple months, right, that the New Testament is to make sure that you don't revolt, right? The New Testament is a literature that paints a submission to Rome. And so it leaves out these things for a reason, right? And so when you read the book of Josephus shines a more light on the actual Jewish revolting against the Romans, right? And so as you can see that they didn't agree with paying taxes, right? They did not agree to submitting to any mortal men, right? And as you can see, they fought back against the Romans, right? And so, like one of my elders said, that reading this document could possibly make you mad, because again, the documents, the literature, the Gospels shine a light to as if God is okay with us being under, as if God is okay with us being under the rulership of Nero, Rome, right? And so we make ourselves enemies unto God if we do not submit it to Rome. When it comes to the Dead Sea Scrolls would not teach you that you make yourself an enemy to God but by submitting to Rome, but that you make yourself an enemy to God by submitting to Rome, right? So one lawgiver, that being God, and that verse right there just says anti-Roman, right? So we look at First Peter chapter 2, verse 13 through 17, where a lot of people like to say that Eusebius mentioned that Peter wrote this, but he also disconcluded that Peter wrote 2 Peter, right? But we're also going to look into possibly why Eusebius allowed this document to be considered orthodoxy, right? So when we look at 1 Peter 2, verse 13 through 17, it says, submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human authority. You see that? This is orthodoxy. This is sound orthodoxy. So this will be allowed, right? So whether to the emperor. So you have Peter, right? a follower of Christ, a Galilean, right? Saying to submit to human authority, right? Something that we just read in Josephus, where Judas the Galilean said it is not righteous to submit to human authority. So we have an orthodoxy, we have a Greco-Roman authority document where saying that Peter is telling us that we are to submit to human authority, whether to an emperor, a supreme authority, or to governors, or sent by him to punish those to do wrong. Now, the issue with this is that the only human authority that Peter and them submitted to was either James, right, or Christ, right? Where Christ, where as far as the historical Jesus would have never told us to submit to any human authority. And we're going to see actually what human authority Yeshua told us to submit to after he left the scene, right? So it says, submit yourselves, but the Lord say to human authority, whether to emperors, right, Nero, as a supreme authority, or to governors, right, Herod, who are sent by him to punish those who do wrong and to commend those who do right, right? For it is God's will that by doing good you should silence the ignorant talk of foolish people, live as free people, but do not use your freedom as a cover for evil. Live as God's slaves. Show proper respect to everyone. Love the family of the believers. Fear God. Honor the emperor. All right. Did you hear this? Right. So, as you can see, it says for interesting. It says for it is God's will that by doing good you should be silent and ignorant talk of foolish people. Live as free people. So remember that Judas the Galilean said that living as free would not be part as submitting to a human being, right? Or again, submitting to human rulership, right? And so I know one could probably come back and pretty much say that, well, Judas the Galilean had followers and people submit to him. But then it goes into argument again, what type of follower is this? Does this follower offer freedom, right, of peace? Is this some type of cult, right? And so I'll leave the audience to decide that, right? So we're dealing with people that believe in one God, Lord, sovereign over all, and believe in true freedom and not submitting unto man, right? And so let's keep on going. So you have one group that wants you to submit to governing authorities, Nero, and one group that is anti-submitting to emperors and governing authorities, right? And so you have first, and so this is where we know that Peter is speaking about, or this has to be written sometime in after AD 60, right? Because Peter mentions Babylon, right? First Peter chapter 5 and 13, she who is in Babylon, chosen together with you, sends you her greetings, as so my Mark, right? And so this is another interesting thing where this shows that also where the Old Testament was also reconstructed in the time of Babylonian, because in Psalms chapter 137, it says, by the rivers of Babylon, we sat and wept. We know that King David was long passed away before Babylon came into power, right? And so this is just one scholarly look at showing two verses where one verse shows that this writing of the Epistle of Peter had to been written sometime in the Roman rulership, because he's writing to those that were scattered after the temple's destruction, right? So that's what he says, right? That's why he says, she who was in Babylon, chosen together with you, sends her greetings, and so does my son Mark, right? And again, Psalms 37, by the rivers of Babylon, she wept, right? Peace and blessings. So we look at chapter 25, the divine scriptures that are accepted and that are not accepted by Eusebius, right? I believe this is, forgot to put the book, I'm gonna put that on there, sorry. But book 3 of Eusebius church history, right? And so what he says is, but we nevertheless feel compelled to give a catalog of those, also distinguishing those works which are according to the ecclesiastical tradition or true and genuine and commonly accepted, right? So he says, from those others, which although not canonical, but disputed, or yet at the same time known, most ecclesiastical writers. We have felt compelled to give the catalog in order that we might be able to know both these works and those that are cited by the heretics under the name of the apostles, including, for instance, such books as Gospel of Peter, Gospel of Thomas, of Matthias, of any others besides them, and the Acts of Andrew and John and other apostles, which no other belongings to the succession of ecclesiastical writers has deemed worthy of mention in his writings, right? So notice it says, and further, the character of style is at variance with apostolic usage, and both the thoughts and the purpose of the things that are related in them are so completely out of accord with the true orthodoxy, right? All right, you see that? So as you can see, this is one proof where it shows where the church fathers, right, where they deemed scriptures, right, that were apostolic and pseudo, right, if you want to use that word, where they would deem these books or what they would call heretics because they were, like you say, out of accord with true orthodoxy, right? So this goes back to agreeing with Dr. Eisman is saying, right? Your gospels present what Eusebius says, like something that would be in accord with orthodoxy, right? Something that is out of accord of orthodoxy would be Dead Sea Scrolls, would be anything that sounds anti-Roman, anti-Pauline, anti-Trinitarian, right? These would be things that would be out of accord with orthodoxy, right? And so, unfortunately, orthodoxy has made its way on our people in other nations and other countries throughout the world. And as we keep on reading, it says that they clearly show themselves to be fictions of heretics, right? Wherefore they are not to be placed even amongst the rejected writings, but all of them to be cast aside as absurd and impious, right? There you have it. So I'm actually going to go into one of the books where he said was absurd and impious, right? That he felt was left orthodoxy, but it's actually historical and it's truth, right? So remember Dr. Ryber Eisenman talked about how James the Judge just comes out of the blue, right? This Jesus brother, which Josephus also talks about, Hegesepius, Eusebius, right? So unfortunately, remember also how, again, we speak about how all these writers speak about the death of James and how the New Testament fails to record the death of James, or it failed to record the choosing of James, right? And so when you go into these rejected gospels of Eusebius, one being the Gospel of Thomas, it actually mentions the choosing of James. And so this is Gospel of Thomas, verse 12. It says, the disciples said to Jesus, we know that you would depart from us. Who is to be our leader? Jesus said unto them, wherefore you are to go unto James the righteous, for whose sake heaven and earth came to being. Now we'll go ahead and give more second and third witnesses, right? Now this is what you will call the Clementia or the Clementine homilies, right? Now the Clementine homilies, this is Clement. Clement was up under Peter for 6 years. This Clement would be the successor of Peter after Peter's martyrdom, right? And he actually kept record of Peter's travels, right? In which he was told to do, and sent a letter off to James regarding what happened between Peter from the time he warned, I guess, James of this enemy that came and misrepresented his teachings and written his teachings to many opinions. He came across the same enemy. They had disputes back and forth on different days regarding certain topics, whether it be one God or multiple gods, whether Jesus is God or Jesus is not God, supernatural dreams and false visions and of that such, right? Whether Yeshua is the Messiah, things of that such of nature, right? And so this Clement writes, beware of false prophets. This is in his homily 11, chapter 30, right? Now we remember that Yeshua told us also to beware of false prophets, right? And so there was a choosing also that had to go on, right? Where again, Christianity believes that Peter was the apostle chosen to rule and govern. And like Dr. Robert Eisenman said, that would be according to the Christian literature of the Gospels. But when you actually see and read the gospel for yourself in Acts chapter 15 and 21, that will actually not be true. So we're going to see also where we are told to compare our letters unto James in this Clementia, right? So it says, then after 3 months were fulfilled, he ordered me to fast for several days, and then brought me to the fountains that are near to the sea and baptized me in ever-flowing water. Thus, therefore, when our brethren rejoiced at my God-gifted regeneration, not many days after, he turned to the elders in the presence of all the church and changed them, saying, our Lord and prophet, who have sent us, declared unto us that the wicked one, having disputed with him 40 days and having prevailed nothing against him, promised that he would send apostles from amongst his subjects to deceive. Wherefore, above all, remember to shun apostles or teachers or prophets who do not first accurately compare his teachings with that of James, right? All praises, who was called the brother of my Lord, and to whom was entrusted to administer the church of the Hebrews in Jerusalem, and that even though he came to you with witnesses, lest the wickedness which disputed 40 days with the Lord and prevailed nothing, should afterwards like lightning fall from heaven upon the earth, send a preacher to your injury, as now he has sent Simon upon us, preaching, right, under pretense of the truth, right? Talking about Simon Magus. Now, again, this goes way back, right, to where Herman determined and says that, what's his name? I get his name mixed up. Rufinus, who translated the Clementia, took out Paul's name and replaced it with Simon. And also, Rufinus also admits, even in his prologue, right, that he made some textual variations, right? So it goes on to say that, wherefore he who has sent us said, many shall come to me in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ravening wolves, right? And we see, we also see a lot of parallels where, again, Paul claims to be Benjamin. Benjamin is called the ravening wolf. As far as light falling from heaven like Satan, we know that Paul's seen a light fall from heaven, right? And he claims that to be Yeshua or Jesus, right? And it goes on to say, this is the footnotes of conjunction reading, which seems probable is useful. He comes you with credentials from James, the whole charges, procure and homilies, recognition, just footnote, right? So I'm going to actually show, this is actually from the Clementine homilies, the Clementia Pseudo-Clementine, right? This is one of the headers of it, epistle of Peter to James. So they always had to compare their letters to James and send their letters off to James. We will actually show these proofs inside the text within themselves in the literature, right, of the Gospels, right? Peter to James, the Lord and Bishop of the Holy Church, under the Father of all, through Yeshua or Jesus Christ, wishes you peace always, right? Footnote, the object of the apocryphal epistle is to account for the late appearance of the homilies. It will be the latest portion of the literature, right? So this will be the latest, right? So epistle of Clement to James, right? This is Clement writing his epistle, his letter to James, which Peter told him to do because this is the correct way. This is the way that Yeshua left behind, and this is how they establish how to keep apostasy away from the church, because apostasy was warned by Yeshua and apostasy happened, right? So it says, Clement to James, the Lord, I, and the Bishop of Bishops who rules Jerusalem, right? The Holy Church of the Hebrews and the churches everywhere, exceedingly founded by the providence of God, with the elders and deacons and the rest of the brethren, peace be always. Now this is the footnote, more probably the Lord's brother. So it must have been in the text from which Rufinus translated that this means James, the Lord's brother, right? So it should have just said Clement to James, the Lord's brother. So Rufinus took that part out, right? That this means James, the Lord's brother, it's quite certain, but it is not necessary to adopt this reading here. Chapter 20 and the opening sentence in the previous epistle, recognition 374, Clement is represented as writing my Lord James, right? And we can also second witness this in Jude chapter 1, right? So we can second witness this even in your literature, where it should actually say Clement to James, the Lord brother. When you look in Jude chapter 1, it says that Jude, a servant of Jesus, which I actually believe it should be Jude, a brother of Jesus and the brother of James, right? And this is for purpose is right, I can prove that because when we look at Matthew chapter 13 and 55, this is what it says, right? It's not this the carpenter's son. It's not this the mother called Mary. It's not his brethren, James, Josie, Simon, and Jude. So again, that's very spectacular. That's just one of my scholarly previews on Jude chapter 1:1. Jude, the brother of Yeshua and the brother of James, to them that are sanctified. Now we're going to go in Jude later on, right? But we're just showing this spectacular use of James, right? This James, Jesus' brother, that Christianity written out, maybe like Dr. Ayman said, maybe not on purpose, because we can actually see James in the light of the scriptures, Acts 15 and 21. So they didn't completely write them out. And we have to give them that, right? So now we go into Acts chapter 15. Now we're going to talk about the letters, right? We're going to show you how Paul had a problem with James, right? Acts chapter 15, it says, when they finished, James spoke up. Brothers, he said, listen to me, right? This is when Paul goes down to Jerusalem, right? If this account is true regarding circumcision, right? It says, James says, it is my judgment, therefore, right? Let me read that again. When they finished, James spoke up, not Peter, not Paul, not Barnabas, right? Not any of the other apostles, not Thomas, not Jude. This is James' final decision at the Council of Jerusalem as he gives order unto Paul, right? He says, when they finished, James spoke up. Brothers, he said, listen to me. It is my judgment, therefore, that we should not make it difficult for the Gentiles who are turning to God. Instead, we write to them, right? So this is supposed to be a letter from James. We write to them, telling them to abstain from food polluted by idols, from sexual immorality, from the meat of strangled animals, and from blood. For the law of Moses had been preached in every city for the earliest times, and is read in the synagogues on every Sabbath, right? Now, notice how it talks about the synagogues that is read on every Sabbath, right? Now, that's a red flag, something to actually kind of listen to, right? Because synagogues actually came commonly known amongst the Essenes once the temple was actually destroyed. So once the temple was destroyed, they set up a lot of synagogues, right? Remember, the temple in Jerusalem is supposed to be the holy place. So the Essenes, or the early Christians, set up a lot of synagogues because, again, the temple was destroyed, right? So, and I refer everybody to read this from the, what I'm reading from right now is the NIV. The NIV actually gives you right now a clearer understanding of what's going on. So in the NIV header, it says the council's letter to the Gentile believers. So now we're going to go again, right? It gave us pretty much what the letter should sound like, right? So we're going to actually see what the letter actually says, right? This is Acts chapter 15, verses 22. It says, then the apostles and elders with the whole church decided to choose some of their own men and sent to them Antioch with Paul and Barnabas. They chose Judas, called Barsabas, and Silas, men who were leaders amongst the believers. With them, they sent the following letter, right? Okay, here we go. Now it says the council's letter to the Gentiles believers. Then the apostles and elders and the whole church decided to choose men of their own men and send them to Antioch with Paul and Barnabas, right? I'm sorry, I've read that already, right? It says the apostles and elders, your brothers, right? To the Gentile believers in Antioch, Syria, and Cilicia, greetings. Notice, right? So this is the letter. The apostles and elders, your brothers, to the Gentile believers in Antioch, Syria, and Cilicia, greetings. We are reading the letter. Now, this is what the letter says. We have heard that some went out from us. This is James, right? This is James' speech in the letter, right? We have heard that some went out from us without our authorization and disturbed you. So James is saying that Paul and others have went out, right, without the authorization of James. That's very important. So the authorization of James is very important in the text, right? So James says that Paul and others went out without his authorization and disturbed you, right? Disturbed who? Antioch, Syria, and Cilicia, troubling your minds by what they said. So we all agreed to choose some men and send them to you with our friends Barnabas and Paul, men who have risked their lives for the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. Therefore, we are sending Judas and Silas to confirm by word of mouth what we are writing, right? It says, it seemed good to the Holy Spirit and to us not to burden you with anything beyond the following requirements. You are to abstain from food sacrificed to idols, from blood, from the meat of strangled animals, and from sexual immorality. You do well to avoid these things, right? Now we go to Paul. Paul has a problem with this authority, right? Now remember, right? We talked about submitting to human authority. Sometimes submitting to human authority is not so bad, depending on what the human authority is offering, right? In the Council of James, human authority, he is the overseer of Jerusalem. They are called the poor, the Ebion. They all share common things in possession. Nobody has more than another, right? They don't love riches, neither are they just so down to earth poor, right? God is their king. The law is their king, right? Yahshua is the master teacher, right? And they set up teachers of righteousness all over in these synagogues, right? Because they are spread out through the world. And, you know, you can't be in one place and at once everywhere. So they set up these master teachers in these synagogues, right? Or these teachers of righteousness in these synagogues, right? And they continue on the teachings of these so-called Essenes or Ebionites or whatever Yahshua left behind. So in this order of authorization, you always need a letter of representation from James. Now, we showed in earlier scriptures in the Clementia where you must compare your writings unto James. We see Peter writing letters unto James, Clement writing letters unto James. We see in the Gospel of Thomas where it was told what we are to go unto James to judge the righteousness after Yahshua departs. Now we see where Paul has an issue with these letters of authorizations in 2 Corinthians chapter 3, right? Are we beginning to commend ourselves again? Or do we need, like some people, letters of recommendation to you or from you? You yourselves are our letter, written on our hearts, known and read by everyone. You show that you are a letter from Christ, the result of our ministry, written not with ink, but with the Spirit of the living God, not on tablets of stone, but on tablets of human heart. You see this? You see what's going on? Paul has an issue with the governing authorities in Jerusalem. And again, you see the name of the channel, Paul and Nero Sparked the Jewish War. All right. So I'm going to show you how, right? The Dead Sea Scrolls, right, is a spark for a preparation for the Roman and Jewish war, Roman and Jewish revolt, Jewish war against the Roman revolt, right? And not submitting it to subjecting authorities and emperors and kings. As well as the literature of the Gospels wants you to submit and subject yourself to the authorities and emperors, right? And so we see Paul having a problem with James, Jesus' brother, the one in authority, right? Here we go. Now, interesting thing when you look in Jude, we look in Jude chapter 1, right? Same thing. Notice the parallels. Jude chapter 1, verses 1 through 4, and I'm going to read verses 8, right? Jude, a servant, right? Or a brother of Christ and a brother of James. To those who have been called, who are loved in God the Father and kept for a Jesus Christ, mercy, peace, and love be yours in abundance. The sin of doom, right? This is the header. The sin and doom of ungodly people, right? Now, this is a warning against a certain enemy, right? And I'll allow you guys to make this parallel, right? And we'll see. Now, he's going to warn you of a certain group of people that of apostasy, right? This is the apostasy that begins within the church, right? He says, dear friends, Although I was very eager to write to you about the salvation we share, it says, I felt compelled to write and urge you to contend for the faith that was once and for all entrusted to God's holy people. It says, for certain individuals whose condemnation was written about long ago have secretly slipped in amongst you, right? Have secretly slipped in amongst you. That goes back to the wheat and the tares, right? It goes back to the wheat and the tares. The tares, right, are the individuals whose condemnation was written about long ago, right? That secretly slipped in amongst us, that secretly slipped in amongst the wheat. These are ungodly people who pervert the grace of our God into license for immorality and deny Jesus Christ, our only and sovereign master, right? So listen, so when you jump down to verse 8, it says, in the very same way, on the strength of our dreams, these ungodly people pollute their own bodies, reject the authority, and heap abuse on celestial beings, right? So it says that this enemy, these ungodly people, right? They pollute their bodies, right? So what does he mean by pollute their bodies? This has to be something possibly has something to do with the sacrificings of idols, eating flesh and meat sacrificing to idols, right? And then it says they reject authority. So remember how we read just in 2 Corinthians how Paul was rejecting the authority of James, right? And then we talked about they heap abuse on celestial beings, right? So who do we know, right? It's always have their heads in the clouds, right? So let's look at Galatians chapter 1, verse 15 through 16. It says, but when God, who set me apart from my mother's womb and called me by his grace, was pleased to reveal his son in me. How was he revealed? So that I might preach to him amongst the Gentiles. My immediate response was not to consult, but was consult into any human being, right? So Paul says he didn't consult with any human being regarding the Son of God. So this also will be a reason why you don't see any verses about Paul talking about the life of Christ, right? Because remember, he wasn't there. He doesn't know Christ. So he makes the accusation that he knows Christ from an apparition, right? These celestial beings. Here we go. Here we go. 1 Corinthians chapter 9 and 1. Paul writes as an apostle, am I not free? Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen Jesus our Lord? Are you not the result of my work in the Lord, right? When did he see Christ? 1 Corinthians 9 and 1. Am I not free, right? I'm sorry. Paul's vision in his horn. It says, I must go on boasting, although there is nothing to be gained, right? We're still in 1 Corinthians, right? I will go on to visions. Here we go. I will go on to visions and revelations from the Lord. I know as a man in Christ who 14 years ago was caught up to the third heaven, whether it was in the body or out of the body, I do not know, right? God knows. And I know that this man, whether in the body or apart from the body, I do not know. But God knows, was caught up to paradise and heard inexpressible things that no one is permitted to tell. Now, you must understand, the reason I love these type of writings and literature, though I disagree with it, because this shows you how people once believed and how their imaginations ran wild. So when we talk about Paul having Roman background and possibly Herodian bloodline, we talk about someone whose literature shows him having a Roman belief system, right? So Romans believed in these higher celestial beings, the gods, the Zeus, you know how the story goes, the Greek Genesis, how they call it, or the Greek Genesis or the Roman Genesis, right? So this is what you see in Paul's vision in his thorn, right? This is what you see, a Roman, a Roman polytheistic view in his teachings, right? Whether it's from the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows, and I know this man, whether in the body or out of the body, right? So he says that, in his vision, this person was caught up, to the third heaven, right? And so these would not be teachings of the earlier Christians or earlier followers of Christ, right? But this would be allowed in the Greek. This would be allowed in the Greek Gospels because, you know, they are Greek Gospels, right? And this is what Greeks believed in. I also want to make a note on that also as well. Josephus also said that the Greeks do not have a history or a language, and he's not saying that out of way of it never happened. What he's saying is their language and their history was destroyed. And he said that the Greeks steal a lot of their history and their beliefs from Phoenicians, Chaldeans, and Egyptians, in which those people did not lose a lot of their things due to wars because they were not in a lot of wars. And so the Greeks were in thousands and thousands and thousands of wars. So a lot of things did not survive from them. And even the things that are written upon them from Greek philosophers and other philosophers, like Josephus said, they do not line up, right? They contradict each other, right? So this could also be another work on the Grecian works, on those where they find our works, the Jews' works, and they invade the scriptures with their Greco-Roman beliefs, right? So when we look at 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 11 through 13 and 15 through 16, right? Notice this what it says, Paul's concerns for the Corinthians, right? Now, there's a reason why there are concerns from the Corinthians, right? Because not everyone believed Paul's vision and his ministry, right? Regarding those who followed even Christ, right? And probably other followers of other religions as well. And I'm going to prove this, right? Verse 11, he says, have I made you a fool of myself? So he has a major concern, right? So these people don't believe Paul's ministry and his vision, his dreams, his head being so high in the clouds, these celestial beings, the third heaven, these visions, right? So apparently, Paul feels as if he has made himself a fool unto these Corinthians, right? But you drove me to it. I ought to have been commended by you, for I am not in the least inferior to the super apostles, right? So he says that these Jews in Corinth, right, should have been commended by Paul, right? He says, for I am not least inferior to the super apostles, right? Now, notice how he calls them the super apostles, right? You got to understand the language a lot of things are spoken in. And this is not someone who is speaking in a light towards the 12 apostles in a good way, right? So Paul is furious at this moment, right? So like he says, have I made a fool of myself, right? I should have been commended by you, right? For I am not least inferior to the super apostles or the 12 apostles, right? So Paul's mad, even though I am nothing, I perverse in demonstrating amongst you, right? So that's where he kind of gets you guys at, right? He kind of boasts, right, at not being inferior to the super apostles, right? But at the same time, kind of humbles himself at the same time and saying, for at the same time, I'm nothing, right? But no, wait a minute though, right? You just let it be known you are not inferior to these super apostles, right? Although you really are, right? And so he says, I perverse and demonstrators amongst you the marks of a true apostle, right? The marks of a true apostle, right? Including signs, wonders, and miracles, right? So notice how he said, including signs, wonders, and miracles, right? So his concerns again are that, right, these Jews or these Corinthians do not believe in his signs, wonders, and miracles, right? And it says, how are you inferior to the other churches, except that I was never a burden to you? Forgive me this wrong. He says, I will very gladly spend for everything I have and expand myself as well. If I love you more, I will love, he says, will I love me, will you love me less? But that may have not been a burden to you, yet crafty fellow that I am. I caught you by trickery, right? So he's not saying that he caught them by trickery, but what he's saying basically is that these Jews at Corinth don't believe his signs, wonders, and miracles, and that they believe that he tried to catch them by trickery or that he caught them by trickery, right? So not everyone believed in the writings of this Paul the apostle, right? And so we're going to show also all throughout history how the history of not believing in this Paul the apostle or the history of these Essenes or Ebionites continued on their doctrine that Paul was never considered an apostle. He was always in an apostate, right? Peace and blessings, family, right? So we're going to show this. So here, again, like we just showed, these Jews believed that Paul, was trickery, very crafty, his signs, his wonders. He was not an apostle, right? So Paul lets me know I am an apostle and I'm not inferior to the super apostles, right? So 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 10 through 17. Thank you for the shares and likes, right? It says a church divided over leaders. Now we're going to show, right, the church being divided, right? It says, I appeal to you, brothers and sisters, in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that all of you agree with one another in what you say, and that there be no divisions amongst you. Well, apparently there is divisions, right? And the division was already prophesied by Yeshua, that there would be many false Christs and many false apostles, right? And so, and we have to agree when it comes to the teaching of Yeshua, we have to agree with him when he's right, when he know he's right, right? Accordingly, when it comes to prophecy, right? Because again, the Greeks wrote certain things in there, right, that were not of the prophetic historical Yeshua that we're speaking of, that we're trying to search out through this presentation, right? We'll get to it. So what it says is, but that you be perfectly united in mind and thought, which is actually true and correct. We should be perfectly united in mind and thought, but apparently, right, that's not what's going on, because there are different doctrines, and we're going to show this and prove this, right? My brothers and sisters, some from Chloe's household have informed me that there are quarrels amongst you. What I mean is this. Notice what he says. One of you says, I follow Paul. Another says, I follow Apollos. Another says, I follow Cephas. Another says, I follow Christ, right? Well, let's see. Verse 13 says, is Christ divided? Apparently at this moment, he is, right? Was Paul crucified for you? Were you baptized in the name of Paul? He says, I thank God that I did not baptize any of you except Crispus and Gaius. You see, Paul is angry. He said, I thank God I didn't baptize any of y'all, right? Why not? Because they didn't believe in Paul's visions, his signs, his wonders. They believe it was trickery, right? So he says, no one can say that you were baptized in my name, right? He said, yes, I also baptized the household of Stephanus, right? Beyond that, he says, I don't remember if I was baptized. He said, I don't remember if I baptized anyone else, right? How do you not remember if you didn't baptize anyone else? But okay, for Christ did not send me to baptize, but to preach the gospel, not with wisdom and eloquence, lest the cross of Christ be emptied of his power, right? So notice in Acts chapter 2, verse 42, right? This is something like Dr. Robert Eisen been saying, right? Certain things in the book of Acts is actually historical, right? And I'm going to show something that I would agree that would be historical, right? That wouldn't sound so literatureless, right? And we're going to prove it. So in Acts chapter 2, verse 42, it says, they devoted themselves to the apostles' teachings and to the fellowship and to the breaking of bread and to prayer. Now, that's a very important thing. It says to the apostles' teaching, right? So remember how Paul talked about you may follow Paul, you may follow Cephas, you may follow Apollos, one may say you may follow Christ, right? So understand, in Acts chapter 2 and verse 42 is very important to me because it says the apostles' teachings. Well, what were the apostles' teachings, right? Well, we would have to search out through history what would be the teachings of the apostles, right? Well, we know that according to history, the only gospel around this time of the apostles' teachings of Acts chapter 2 and 42 would have to be the gospel of Matthew, right? Because Matthew was the only one that composed the gospel in Hebrew. At this time, there would be no gospel of Mark. There would be no Gospel of Luke. There will be no Gospel of John. There will be no 1st, 2nd, 3rd John. There will be no 1st Peter. There will be no Revelations, right? It will be none of these things. The only thing, right, there will be no epistles of Paul's, right? No 14 epistles, right? The only thing that they would have at this time in Acts chapter 2, verse 42 would be the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew, right? So with that being said, and then we'll also talk about later on how other teachings, right, also became teachings of these apostles through traditions that were later added on regarding that may be like the Didache, right? Or like I said, the Clementine homilies, right? And we approve these things, right? So I'm just going to give you guys references, right? Showing proof is Poppaea of Hierapolis, century 60 to 130 AD, a source quoted in Eusebius, Church History, Book 3, Chapter 39, paragraph 16, right? As well as Irenaeus against heresies, Book 3, Chapter 1 and paragraph 1. Origen also quoted it in Eusebius Church History, Chapter 6, Book 6, Chapter 25, paragraph 4, as well as Book 3, Chapter 24, paragraph 6, and Book 3 and 39. Epiphanius of 29, Book 29, Chapter 9 and 4, as well as 51, 5 and 1. And Jerome in his against Pelagians 3 and 2. All of those guys mention how though the Ebionites, right, the Ebion carried a Hebrew gospel, right? And so that Hebrew gospel is only quoted today through the mouths of the early church fathers, right? And we are also mentioning through them later, right? And so I'm going to actually read some of these historical sources. I'm pretty sure you guys want to hear this, but I'm going to actually read Jerome, right? Because Jerome is actually the one out of all the so-called church fathers and historians, right, who translated the so-called this Hebrew gospel, right, into Latin. And so this is what it says, and this is what you guys don't have in your literature or your New Testament, right? And this is important because this shows a part of James being very important in the Hebrew gospel, in which he is not really much important in the literature. It shows as important, but it doesn't echo the importance as it would in the Hebrew gospel that the apostles carried around, right? So according to Jerome, one famous man, he says also the gospel which is named according to the Hebrews, right? All praises, and which was recently translated by me into Greek and Latin, which also Origen often used, refers after the resurrection of the Savior, right? Then it goes on to say, this is what it says. But the Lord, when he had given the shrewd, right, I guess the bread, to the servant of the priest, went to James and appeared to him. James indeed had sworn. Now we know that James does not swear. We know James is against swearing, right? So it's just as simple as James could have just simply said, no, right? I would not eat bread. But the writer is saying, right? Jerome, who is one translating and writing about what he's saying in this Hebrew gospel, is saying that James swore, right? And so James indeed, right, I will say, said that he would not eat bread from that hour when he had drunk the chalice of the Lord until he saw him risen from amongst those who sleep. And again, a little bit bear forth said to the Lord at table and bread, right? So he's reading the translations from this Hebrew gospel, right, that we don't have today, right? And immediately is added, he bore bread and he blessed it and he broke it and he gave it to James the just. And he said to him, my brother, eat your bread, because the Son of Man has resurrected from amongst those who sleep, right? And here I give the actual Greek, the Greek translation to it, right? So as you can see, James is a very important figure of this Hebrew gospel, which we do not have today, but Jerome shows right what he translated from it, correct? All praises. Very important work, right? So this would be something possibly that we read in Acts chapter 2:42, where it talks about the apostles' doctrine. And notice how it also talks about the breaking of bread a lot. And also that's what we talked about in Acts chapter 2, where it talks about the teachings of the apostles and the breaking of bread, correct? All praises, right? Now, this is Gregory of Tours, right? Book of 10 Histories, book 1 and 22, right? This is in-depth research, all praises. He says, it is said that James the apostle, when he had seen the Lord already dead on the cross, cursed and swore never to eat bread unless he should discern the Lord's rising, right? When on the third day the Lord returned, having despoiled Taurus with his triumph, he showed himself to James and said, rise, James, eat, because I have already resurrected from the dead. This is the James just, whom they called the brother of the Lord, since he was the son of Joseph, born from another mother, right? Now, sir, a lot of historians don't believe James was born of another mother, but of the same mother of Yeshua, Mary. But this is also represented and seen in the proto-evangelion of James, that he came from another mother. Against most scholars, I'm not going to say, some scholars would say that that story that James come from another mother is only to protect the virgin birth, only to protect the virgin birth myth, right? Now, this is another one, right? This is Pseudo-Ebadiah's Apostolic History 6 and 1. Don't ask me how I found it, but I was able to find it and get a resource. It's very hard to find. If you won't be able to find it, they say it was destroyed, but somebody actually had it. I was able to get it, right? You guys can look this up and actually tell you what's going on with it. What it says is, of those, James the Lesser by birth was always first beloved by Christ. Notice it's called James the Lesser. This is James the Just, James, Jesus' brother. And like Robert Eisman say, we don't know what is so less about James the Just, right? So they just made him less, right? So, beloved by our Savior in turn, right? Turned burned with such desire for the master that he was crucified. He wished not to take food until he saw him rising from the dead, which he and his brother remembered was predicted while he was active amongst the living. Now, remember, right? Remember, these are Greeks, right? And other people translating these scriptures, right? Or saying that they've seen these scriptures, right? So you got to be careful with these writings, right? So therefore, he wished, first of all, to appear to him, to both Mary Magdalene and Peter, to confirm the disciple in faith and not to allow him to suffer from fasting any longer. And he offered him a honeycomb, right? Notice it says he offered him a honeycomb and invited James to eat, right? So the particular thing about this scripture is the honeycomb is also talked about in, I believe, Luke, right? But with Luke, there's fish with the honeycomb. The fish is omitted with this, right? So, and invited James to eat, right? So, as you can see, James plays an important character amongst the apostles. This is Jacobus Vigorine Legenda Euro 67th century. It says century 2367. On the preparation, however, when the Lord had died, just as Josephus and Jerome say in the book of Illustrious Men, James took an oath not to eat until he saw the Lord rise from the dead on the same day of the resurrection. However, he since, right up until that day, James had not enjoyed food. The Lord appeared to him and to those who were with him. He said, put up a table and bread. Next, he accepted bread and blessed it and gave it unto James the Just, saying, rise, my brother, eat, because the Son of Man has risen from the dead. Right? And then I also give the Greek translation on that, right? And then we'll read one more Irish Reference Bible, right? This is the Irish Reference Bible, Eput Muna Codex Latinus. I guess more Greek words, right? So it says, Josephus says that it was on this account of his murder, right? Listen to this. Josephus said, on this account of his murder, that Jerusalem was overthrown. About him and his gospel, according to the Hebrews, testifies, right? And so notice how it says, right, that according that Jerusalem was overthrown. We're going to get into that, right? This is what we're talking about. Paul and Nero sparked the Jewish war. So according to the Irish reference, right, Josephus says that it was on this account of James the Just's murder that Jerusalem was overthrown. right? This is where Jerusalem starts to get burnt down. This is where the Jewish and Roman war begins. Why wouldn't it get burned down? If sects of Jerusalem around you are in agreement with Herodians and Romans, what you think is going to happen? Especially those that's not willing to submit to these people. Here we go. All praises. It says, about him, his gospel, according to the Hebrews, testify that it has been translated by me into Greek and Latin, which also Origen used when it says, after the resurrection of the Lord, when he had given a shroud to the servant of the priest, went to James and appeared to him. For James had sworn that he would not eat bread from that hour in which the Lord drank the cup until he saw his resurrection from the dead. After the Lord blessed the bread and broke it and gave it to James, saying, my brother, eat your bread because the Son of Man has arisen, right? I give more Greek translation, right? So here we go. Let's carry on, right? So remember, we talked about the different sects of the different peoples, right? So I don't pretty much too much have to go in, but remember Paul talked about this Apollos, right? Him being someone of a leader of a sect, right? So in Acts chapter 18, verses 24 through 27, we'll give a little history of him, and then we'll give second, third, and fourth witness of scripture. You guys can go and look this up for yourselves. Meanwhile, a Jew named Apollos, a native of Alexandria, came to Ephesus. He was a learned man with a thorough knowledge of the scriptures, right? He had been instructed in the way of the Lord and spoke with a great fever and taught about Jesus accurately, though he knew only the baptism of John. He began to speak boldly in the synagogue. When Priscilla and Aquila heard him, they invited him into their homes and explained to him the way of God more adequately. When Apollos wanted to go to Achaia, the brothers and sisters encouraged him and wrote to the disciples there that welcomed him, right? When he arrived, he was a great help to those who by grace had believed, for he vigorously refuted the Jewish opponents in public debates, proving from the scriptures that Jesus was the Messiah, right? Now, it's not too much work on this Apollos guy, and I'm going to keep on doing work on him, right? It's and the second and third witness will be Acts 19 and 1, 1 Corinthians 1, 12 and 3, as well as 4 through 6, 16 and 12, and Titus 3 and 13 regarding the Apollos, right? Now let's get into more of the scriptures, right? Now remember, in Romans chapter 2 and 16, right, regarding different doctrines and leaders, Paul says, in the day when God shall judge the secrets of men by Jesus Christ according to my gospel, right? He says, my gospel, not according to the teachings of the apostles or the doctrines of the apostles, right? You won't be judged, right? According to Acts chapter 2 and 42, you won't be judged according to the apostles' doctrine, but you'll be judged according to Paul's gospels, right? Romans chapter 16 and 25, now to him that is of power to establish you according to my gospel and the preaching of Jesus Christ according to the revelation of mystery, which was kept in secret since the world began, right? So, right, this mystery has been kept, right, from the world since the world began according to Paul's gospel. It was revealed unto Paul, right? I guess Christ didn't reveal any of these mysteries to his apostles while he was here. And so they are here and they are being revealed. 2 Timothy chapter 2 and 8, again, through his gospels, right? Remember that Jesus Christ of the seed of David was raised from the dead according to my gospel. Do you hear that, right? This is why I say you got to be very careful with Greek gospels, right? Because we have a lot of people of Greek backgrounds who have translated our Hebrew gospels into Greek, and talking about this raising of the dead. But according to Paul says that he was raised from the dead according to his gospel. And we know that that doctrine, right, is very Greco-Roman, right? Fathers of the church history, book 3, 7 through 8, right? Listen to this, right? He tells you what Paul actually means by his gospel. This is Eusebius, Church History, Book 3, 7-8. But Luke, who was of Antiochian percentage of a physician by a profession, and who was especially intimate with Paul and well acquainted with the rest of the apostles, has left us, and 2 inspired books, proof of that spiritual healing art which he learned from them. One of these books is the Gospel, which he testifies that he wrote as those who were from the beginning eyewitnesses and ministers of the word delivered unto him, all of whom, as he says, he followed accurately from the first. Luke chapter 1, verse 2-3. The first book is the Acts of the Apostles, which he composed not from the accounts of others, but from what he had seen himself, right? Paragraph 8. And they say that Paul meant to refer to Luke's gospel wherever, as if speaking of some gospel of his own. He used the words according to my gospel. Let that sink in, right? Brothers and sisters, we do not want you to be uninformed about those who sleep in death, so that you do not grieve like the rest of mankind, who have no hope. For we believe that Jesus died and rose again, and so we believe that God will bring with Jesus those who have fallen asleep in him, according to the Lord's word. We tell you that we who are still alive, who are left until the coming of the Lord, will certainly not precede those who have fallen asleep. For the Lord himself will come down from heaven with a loud command, with the voice of the archangel, and with a trumpet call of God, and the dead in Christ will rise first. After that, we who are still alive and are left will be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air, and so we will be with the Lord forever. Therefore, encourage one another with these words. That is Paul. You see, that is Paul. This is Paul's gospel. Jesus raises from the dead. We're going to be caught up with Christ. He's going to come back with a loud trumpet from heaven, with an archangel. You know, this is the gospel. This is literature. This is Romanized. This is Greco-Roman. This is Greco-Roman belief. And their gods coming from the heaven and destroying. This is what has made it into the text. This is what has made it into the text. This is what you consider orthodoxy, right? This will be considered in line with orthodoxy, right? And I know one might come to mind and try to say, and I believe that was 1 Thessalonians 4, right? Yeah, that's 1 Thessalonians 4, right? 1-13. Make sure I put that on there, right? So that's 1 Thessalonians, right? Know that for a fact. That's 4. Sorry, 13 through what? 13 through 17, right? So now here's the interesting thing, right? Now we talked about different sects, different beliefs, different religions, right? And these different sects were recorded by historians, church historians. We look in Eusebius, Ecclesiastical History 4:22-6, the name. It says the same writer who also records the ancient heresies, right? He's talking about Hegesippus, right? Who was a Nazarene himself, which arose from amongst the Jews in the following words. There were moreover various opinions. Did you hear that? Various opinions in the circumcision amongst the children of Israel. The following were those that were opposed to the tribes of Judah and the Christ, right? Did you hear that? Opposed to the tribe of Judah and the Christ. So Christ himself had a sect that was behind him, right? That was in Jerusalem. They were not called Christians. And we're going to search this out. He says, Essenes, Galileans, Hermobaptists, Maspatians, Samaritans, Sadducees, and Pharisees, right? Here's another witness. This is the dialogue with Typho, chapter 80. And Typho to this replied, I remark to you, sir, that you are very anxious to be safe in all respects, since you cling to the scriptures. But tell me, do you really admit that this place, Jerusalem, shall be rebuilt? And do you expect your people to be gathered together and made joyful with the Christ and the patriarchs and the prophets, both men of our nation, right? Proselytes who joined them before the Christ came, right? And he says, or have you given away and have admitted this in order to the appearance of the worst of the controversies? Then I answered, I am not so miserable, fellow Trypho, as to say one thing and think another. I admitted to you formerly that I and many others of this opinion, and I believe that such will take place, as you surely are aware. But on the other hand, I signify to you that many who belong to the pure and pious faith and are true Christians think otherwise. Moreover, I pointed out to you that some who are called Christians but are godless and pious heretics teach doctrines that are in every way blasphemous, atheistical, and foolish. But that you may know that I do not say this before you alone, I shall draw up a statement so far as I can, right? He goes on to say, of all the arguments which have passed between us, in which I shall record myself as admitting the very same thing which I admit to you. For I choose to follow not men or men's doctrine, but God and the doctrines delivered by him. For if you have fallen in with some who are called Christians, but who do not admit this truth and venture to blaspheme the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac and the God of Jacob, who said that there is no resurrection of the dead and that their souls, when they die, are taken to heaven, do not imagine that they are Christians, even as one, if he rightly consider it, would not admit that the Sadducees are similar sects of Janus, Muriste, Galileans, Hellenists, Pharisees, Baptists, or Jews do, right? Not everyone believed that doctrine. But unfortunately, right, not everyone believed that doctrine. Unfortunately, someone has agreed that that doctrine is true and opposed that doctrine upon us, and that became the mainstream thought. That became the mainstream belief, right? Right? That there is a resurrection of the dead and that there are souls that when they die, they are taken up to heaven, right? Right? There is no proof. Not everyone believes that. And so anyone who doesn't believe that is deemed a heretic. Did you hear what Eusebia said, right? I'm sorry, that was Typho, right? So listen to this. But I and others who are right-minded Christians on all points, it's a Christian, are assured that there will be resurrection of the dead in 1,000 years in Jerusalem, which will then be built, adorned, and enlarged, the prophet Ezekiel and in Isaiah and others declare. This is a Christian document. You should be very careful with agreeing with early Christians. I wouldn't want to have nothing in mind with these folks right here. Listen to this. Apostolic Constitutions, right? 6-7, right? Chapter 6, the same way. For even the Jewish nation had wicked heresies. For of them were the Sadducees, who do not confess the resurrection of the dead, and Pharisees, who ascribe the practice of sinners to fortune and faith, right? He says the Basmoteans, who deny the providence and say that the world is made by spontaneous motions and take away the immorality of the soul, right? And the Baptists, who every day, unless they wash, do not eat, right? Who some believe who some may believe they actually got this confused with the Essenes. It says, nay, and unless they cleanse their bodies and tables or platters and cups and seats, do not make use of any of them. And those who are newly risen amongst us, the Ebionites, who will have the Son of God to be a mere man, begotten by human pleasure in the conjunction of Joseph and Mary. You see, there are also those that separate themselves from all these and observe the laws of their fathers, and these are the Essenes, right? These therefore arose amongst the former people, and now the evil one who is wise to do mischief, and as for goodness, knows so good things, has cast out some from amongst us, and has wrought by them heresies and schisms, right? So as you can see, they went by Ebionites, or what they called Essenes. I'm going to also show you by Epiphanius' own words how even the Nazarenes were also mixed in with these Essenes. So with all these Greek interpretation and Greek gospels, you also have to be careful with the church fathers because they also get it mixed up. They don't know who's really who. Osaeans, Osaeans, Essenes, Jesseans, Nazarenes, Ebionites, right? And so they try to confuse us. Even goers to Forrest is saying there was somebody named Ebion who started the Ebionites, where there is no proof that one person started this Ebionites, right? I'm talking about this person named Ebion, right? And so we can see the term Ebion all throughout the scriptures, but we can also see the master over the Ebion would be Yahshua or the Christ, right? The leader of the poor ones, right? We see this. So if anything, it would be Yahshua would be the one of this Ebion, or someone of a James the Just, or Simon, Jesus' brother, or Jude, right? So again, like true scholarship says, this can be one trying to cover up the continuation of the anti-Pauline movement, right? Instead of just saying Ebionites, right? And so just saying that this Ebion, this one person, calls Paul an apostate, right? And so that gives room to believe that this is just one person, right? And so no, like again, scholarship says that this was only really probably possibly done to not show the continuation of the anti-Pauline movement, right? That Paul was an apostate, right? In which the Gospels do not portray him to be an apostate. You know, you just can't have that in Orthodox, right? So now it goes on to say, now the original of the new heresies, right, began this way. The devil entered into one Simon of the village called Gethe, Samaritan by profession, of a magician, made him the minister of the wicked beings, right? It says, of these three lists, Hegesippus names of all four mentioned by Josephus includes no names. Not also mentioned in another list includes only one group that is relatively obscure outside of these lists. Macedonians includes no groups that are found as of the names Christian groups and Hellenists, Ebionites, and other traditions, right? And then it says, it's chronologically the earliest chasing Hegesippus, while none that ensures accuracy. It is interesting nonetheless. The Mesopotamians may just be based on the Aramaic for baptizers, making it essentially a repetition intended to drag the list out to 7. Daily Baptists and Baptists in Greek and Aramaic, respectively. The list in the Apostle Constitution appears to derive somehow from the list of the early 2nd century understanding of the term Galileans had been lost by this time, and because Ebionites came to be viewed as Judaizing heresy, right? With all this in mind, with the list in Josephus, with that of the other primary sources regarding Samaritans and Baptists, at least 6 of these are historical Jewish sects, or whatever you want to call them, around the time of the 1st and 2nd century. Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, right? And it says Zealots, Galileans, and Sicarii, these will be all within one group. Samaritans, Baptists, and Hermobaptists, and Macedonians, right? This would be all one group. So again, they would say that the Zealots, Galileans, and Sicarii would be the same people. The Baptists, Hermobaptists, and Macedonians will also be the same people, right? And then in the footnotes, again, it goes on to say that there is a legitimate question on whether it is possible to identify these Essenes with the Baptists, Hermobaptists, and Mesopotamians, right? So here we go. It says, Essenes bathe daily in a frigid water for purification and participate in various trades, right? And this can be seen in Jewish War, Book 2, 1 and 29. Elsewhere, Josephus explains Judeans who experience nocturnal emissions plunge into the cold water the next day. This would be Josephus' Antiquities 3, 263. He himself was no stranger to the purifactory cold bath. He boasts in the life too that when he was with Banus, right? Banus was in a scene. He bathed frequently in the frigid water day and night for the purification, right? So Josephus is well acquainted with the tribe of the Essenes, or the Ebionites that came from Christ in Judea. In Judea, it says, in which case the list reduces to 5 brackets for the names omitted by Josephus: Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, right? Or these, right? So the Essenes turned into Baptists, Hymenobaptists, or Mesopotamians, right? With John called the Baptists in Antiquities 18, 5, and 2, right? And then you just have the Zealots, Sicarii, and the Galileans all in one bunch in the 5, right? So it drops down to 5, right? Goes from 7, 6, into 5 within Josephus, right? And then it says, and all these other groups are mentioned in the New Testament Gospels, right? Parentheses or name for the parentheses for the names omitted by the New Testament Gospels and Acts, and I'll just give them out. Pharisees, Matthew chapter 3 and 7, Mark 2 and 16, Luke 5 and 33, John 1, 24, Acts 15 and 5, and then you have and then you also have the Sadducees, Matthew 16 and 1, Mark 12 and 18, Luke 20 and 27, Acts chapter 4 and 1. And of course, the Essenes or the Baptists or the Hymenobaptists or the Mesopotamians will be Matthew chapter 3 and 1, Mark chapter 1 and 4, Luke chapter 7 and 20, John chapter 1 and 28, John the Baptist, right? And then we go with the Zealots, Sicarii, and Galileans will be Mark chapter 3 and 19, Luke chapter 6 and 6, Iscariot, which I always said, Iscariot always seemed like Sicarii scrambled or backwards. Matthew chapter 10 and 14, Luke chapter 22 and 13, John 6, 71 for Iscariot, Luke 6 and 15, and Acts chapter 1 and 13 for Zealot, right? And then, of course, the Samaritans will be Matthew chapter 10 and 5, Luke chapter 9 and 52, John 4 and 39, Acts chapter 8 and 25. While above, we suggest that Baptists and Essenes may have been the same due to similarity of practices, right? So remember, that goes back to where we talked about the Apollos guy, right? Remember, it said that this Apollos guy was very well instructed in the scriptures and also taught how Christ was the Messiah, but he only knew of John's baptism. Goes back to that, right? So while above, we suggest that Baptists and Essenes may have been the same due to similarity practices, daily washing, we might want to separate them again with the recognition that Baptists seem to be uniquely indebted to the person of John the Baptist. You see that? So called by Josephus in Antiquities 18, 5 and 2, entitled such in the Gospels. There is no reference to Baptists, in fact, in either the Gospels or Josephus. Instead, we find reference to John called the Baptist or John the Baptist. This suggests that the Baptists were separate groups, whether split from the Essenes or not, who traced themselves back to John the Baptist. We should then expect our list back out again and note where they were mentioned, right? Peace and blessings. So this pretty much just goes into the patristic list, the Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, Zealots, Samaritans, and Baptists or whatnot. Pretty much want to go ahead and head on down and read this last part before we go into some more historical events. And so it says, out of all these names, the only one given explicitly by Philo and Alexandria is that of the Essenes in 3 different works. Every good man is free, right? See, that would be anti-Roman. Every good man is free, right? Philo is writing before the war, while Josephus' historical book and the New Testament Gospels were written after it. The omission of the Essenes by the authors of the New Testament Gospels may be taken simply as the indication of their late date, thus omitting matters that were more important in the first half of the 1st century when Philo was writing. Perhaps the Essenes were eclipsed by the Baptists as a group that could claim actual membership in the late 1st century or 2nd century, right? In which case, the patristic notices regards the Essenes may simply be relying on Josephus or Philo, both of which were preserved by Christian scribes, right? Other signs of the acronyms in the New Testament Gospels would be their emphasis on the synagogues and their association with Pharisees, which can also be an indication of post-Jewish world point of view when the scattered synagogues began to replace the temple as the focus of Judaism, and some say began to be built at all. Out of all the names mentioned in the New Testament Gospel, the Pharisees are by far the most frequently named. Yes, they are, right? The 7 sects of Judaism against Herodians, right? And this was something I also found in Epiphanius of Panera, where he also mentioned the 7 sects. And I also want to go inside of that, right? This is against Herodians. 7 sects from Judaism, but 20 of the series 23 1 through 3, right? Listen to this. It says, all of the events, these were the 7 sects in Israel, in Jerusalem, in Judea, and the 4 I mentioned in Samaria, in Samaritans in Samaria. But most of them have been eliminated. There is no scribes any longer, no Pharisees, Sadducees, Emerald Baptists, or Herodians. There are only a handful of Nazarenes, perhaps 1 or 2 above the upper thigh bed and beyond Arabia. And the remnant of the Osaeans, no longer practicing Judaism, but joined with the Samsites, who in their turn lived in the territory beyond the Dead Sea. Now, however, they have been united with the sect of the Ebionites, and as a result, they have lapsed from Judaism, and as though a snake's tail or body had been cut off, and a snake with 2 heads and no tail had sprouted from it, grown on and attached to body, chopped off, right? So let's keep going, right? And then he also writes in this book, but I shall resume the thread of my argument against Ebion, right? You see that? You see how he tries to say that there is just this one person named Ebion that started this movement. No, we see this movement in Acts chapter 15 and 21. We see Christ also mention his followers as blessed be ye the poor in spirit. What's that? Luke chapter 4 and 18, right? So like Scholar said, the translator of this wrote just Ebion again, just so that it's a cover up of the continuation of these followers of Christ, the followers of Christ admitting that Paul was an apostate, right? And this was a continuation. And so this blocks the continuation, right? So, and I'm also going to show the continuation as we go through this. And I thank everybody for watching and joining, right? Because of the gospel according to Matthew, of the course of the discussion, obliged to me to insert the whole of the knowledge which I gained, right? So he says, now, in what they call a gospel according to Matthew, thought it not to be the entire gospel, but is corrupted and mutilated, but they use certain other books as well. Did you hear that? So that goes back to Acts chapter 2 and verse 42, right? Where I talked about how it says that people were raised up in the apostles' teachings, right? And then we also talked about how there were different sects, people that follow Apollos, people that follow John the Baptist, people that followed Paul, people that follow, Cephas, which would be a follower of James, right? And so right here, he says that even Epiphanius said that they carried a gospel according to Hebrew, right? And the reason why he's saying it's mutilated is because one reason why it doesn't have a virgin birth, right? And in this Hebrew gospel, it does not echo a Greco-Roman literature, right? And this is what we don't have today. Like I said, it's only quoted through the mouths, mainly of Epiphanius, what we're reading right now, Jerome, what we just read earlier, and like I said, and many other people, right? So I'm getting you in the mindset of what's actually going on, right? And so I would say that the Hebrew gospel sounds doesn't sound polytheistic. The Hebrew gospel abolishes sacrifices. The Hebrew gospel is against the consumption of animal flesh. The Hebrew gospel is an Ebionite poor gospel, right? And more. So to keep on going, right? So he admits that they use a Hebrew gospel. Now that goes back to what I said earlier. In Acts chapter 2 and 42 would just be the Hebrew gospel. As apostasy continues on, they add more books for the sake of documents, right? So they documented the apostasy, they documented the travels, they documented the disputations between Peter and Paul, or Peter and Simon, right? And later these documentations became a part of their books, of their library. So he's going to mention, right, these books, right? And I have these books, right, as well as other Peter, right? He says, but they also use certain books other well. These would be the books that were added on later, right? Supposedly the so-called Travels of Peter, written by Clement, though they corrupt their contents while leaving a few genuine passages. So he's against the Ebionites. He's against the continuation of Paul being apostate. He's also against this Clementine literature. Now, there's also a First Clement epistle that is read, that they claim was read in the churches all the time, right? Which we don't believe is actual, the true, which we don't believe that it is this Clement right here, right? Which it is supposed to be, because it sounds more orthodoxy, right? And so the travels of Peter don't sound orthodoxy, and this will be a problem with them, right? So he says, Clement himself convicts them of every this way in the general epistle, which are read in the holy churches, because his faith and speech are of different character. Then you hear that? So notice what it said: the faith and speech are different, right? The characters are different. So I will agree, and I will say the same thing about this epistle of Clement that they claim that was written, right? And where this epistle of Clement agrees with Paul, right? That would be orthodoxy. Where this epistle of Clement, the travels of Peter, wouldn't agree with Paul, wouldn't sound orthodoxy, right? And again, like he said, is of different character. This is why he's saying it, right? So it says the Spirit's production in his name in the travels, right? Just jump down. Sorry about that. It kind of jumped up. Okay, here we go. Okay, here we go. Ooh, let me get a drink. Excuse me, y'all. Let me get something to drink. All right. All right. All right, we almost done, right? So he says that Clement himself convicts them of every way of his general epistle, which they are read in the holy churches, right? Which they are read in the holy churches, right? Because his faith and speech are different in character, their spirits and production in his name in the travels, which we don't believe those ones that he says are read in the holy churches, right? We don't believe that that's actually the Clement of the travels of Peter. He extols Elijah, David, and Samson, all the prophets who they bore, right? And he goes on to say in the travels, they have changed everything to suit themselves and slandered Peter in many ways, right? So he says that this is considered slander, right? He says because in this book, they say that he was baptized daily, right? And everything that we talked about with the Essenes and the Ebionites and baptism and the baptism, massive baptism, and all these hesmo baptisms, right? So he says that they slander Peter in the travels because they say that he was baptized every day. Remember, they don't like Ebionites, they don't like Essenes, right? They're not orthodoxy, right? For the purification as they are, as they say that he abstained from flesh, right? So right here in the travels of Peter the Clementia, right? It does say that Peter abstained from flesh, that he only ate, I think what he said, what grew of himself, what he ate olives and rarely potted herbs. That's what it said, right? And so, so they again, this is not orthodoxy, right? This is not orthodoxy. So this is slander. So they say that because, you know, in the travels of Peter, Peter is vegan and vegetarian, right? This is slander towards Peter, right? And dressed meat is due, right? So he's going to tell you their reason for, you know, being vegan, right? And any other dish made from meat, since both Ebion, notice how it says Ebion. No, there is no there. You can listen. If anybody goes right now and research who is Ebion, there is not one person that's going to pop up where it's going to say this is Ebion. There is not going to be a one face, right? So this shows corruption in the text, right? He makes it seem as if there's this just one person named Ebion. No, this is a continuation of the Ebionite religion where they abstain from flesh, right? Their Hebrew gospel does not agree with the eating of flesh, right? With the virgin birth, it agrees with baptism, right? So again, like I said, we're fighting against Greco-Roman Hellenization, right? So this Hebrew gospel that we don't have today, right? It's not Greco-Roman, it's not Orthodoxy, right? And this is what your Greek gospels are, right? So it says, when you ask any one of them, why do they eat meat? They have no, having no explanation, they answer foolishly, right? So he's going to say, they answer foolishly. So this is their foolish answer that he says is foolish. Thus, according to their own foolish regurgitations, they are wildly abominable themselves, since they are the results of the intercourse of man and woman. So, according to the Ebionites, the reason why they don't eat flesh is because meat is the result of intercourse between a female animal and a male animal, right? Sperm. So he said they receive baptism apart from their daily baptism, and they celebrate supposed mysteries from year to year in imitation of the sacred mysteries of the church, using unleavened bread and the other part of the mystery with the water only, right? And we're going to read in Acts chapter 2 and Acts chapter 4, which will allude to this, right? He says, but as I said, they set aside by the two who have been appointed by God, one being Christ, but one the devil. And they say that Christ has been allotted the world to come, but that this world has been entrusted to Clementius, or at least a suspicion of the prophets, right? So that's just the footnotes that I put behind, right? And so he also goes on to say in his book, supposedly by the decree of the Almighty at the request of each. And they say that this is why Jesus was begotten of the seed of the man that is chosen, and thus has been named Son of God by the election after the Christ, who came to him from the high in the form of the dove, right? And it says, but they say that he is not begotten of God the Father, but created as one of the archangels, and that he is the ruler both of angels and of all creatures of the Almighty, and that he came and instructed us to abolish sacrifices, right? He says, in their so-called gospel, I came to abolish the sacrifice, and if you cease not from sacrifice, wrath will not cease from you. Both these and certain things of the kind are grateful inventions which are current amongst them, right? And so the interesting thing about that is that that verse is actually, like I will always say, that verse is actually in the Gospels itself in Luke chapter 13, right? But it's just read differently, right? And so in Luke chapter 13, it says they were present that season, some that told him of the Galileans whose blood Pilate had mingled with their sacrifices, right? And so what happened was the Galileans, well, I guess they were sacrifices, and Pilate came and slaughtered them. And when he slaughtered them, their blood had mingled with the blood of the Galileans. What ironic, right? What a coincidence. And so we're going to show you what Jesus said about this situation. And Jesus answered, saying unto them, suppose that yet these Galileans were sinners above all the Galileans. So the Galileans were sinners because they were doing burnt offerings and sacrifices, right? So he says, because they suffer such things. He says, I tell you, nay, but except you repent, you shall not likewise perish. So according to the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew, he says, I came to abolish sacrifice. If you cease not to sacrifice, the wrath of God will not cease from you. And so in Luke chapter 13, that's where they actually had that verse at, where the wrath of God came upon the Galileans for sacrificing. And so since they slaughtered animals, they were slaughtered by Pilate, right? In his wrath, right? And so Christ came, and so Christ said, nay, I came to abolish sacrifices, except you repent, the wrath of God will not, what did he say? Unless you repent, the wrath of God will not cease from you, right? All praises. So he says they speak of other acts of the apostles, right? So notice it talks about other acts of the apostles, which I have what they call the Nazarene acts of the apostles, or the recognitions of the cleanse, or the ascents of James, or like we said, the travels of Peter, right? So notice they try to put a lot of things in different places, but yet a lot of these things really be the same things. Confusion, right? He says they lay down, right? What I just talked about. He says they lay down certain assents and instructions, suppose the assents of James, as though he were giving orders against the temples and sacrifices and fire on the altar and much else that is full of nonsense, right? So like I said, over time, right? When it came to before the church was corrupted, right? So let's break it down. Before the church was corrupted, right? They were like Hezekiah said, they were called virgins. And then when the apostasy came, right? This is when the church became corrupted, right? So before the church was corrupted, they just have the Hebrew gospel, right? As time carries on, where the apostasy comes, this is where the ascents of James comes in, right? And then when Peter starts to travel, right, the ascent of James would be what happened with James and the council and his death, right? And then what attaches on later to it, right, is not only that tradition, but they attach on the tradition of what happened after that with Peter and Simon, or Peter and Paul, their disputations, things like that, and so right now what I'm trying to do is I'm searching out if a lot of these things happen right after the death, right before, so I'm getting it to where I believe it happened right after the death, as they was dispersed after the death of James, right, out of Jerusalem. Peace and blessings, right? So it says, nor are they ashamed to accuse Paul here with certain fabrications, as you can see, right, of their false apostles. Now notice how it goes from just Ebion to they, right? So now you see the cover up. It goes from Ebion to they. He didn't say, nor is Ebion ashamed to accuse Paul. No, he's saying is, nor is the Ebionites ashamed to accuse Paul. So there was a continuation of this. The Ebion throws you off. No, there is a continuation, right? And even today in history, he was never considered an apostle, but the Gospels, the literature pushes him to be this way, right? Orthodox. They say that he was a Tarsan, which he himself admits and does not deny. And they suppose that he was a Greek percentage, taking the occasion for this form. Same passage because of his frank statement, I am a man of Tarsus, a citizen of no man's city. Then they claimed that he was a Greek and the son of a Greek, mother of a Greek father, but that he had gone up to Jerusalem, stayed there for a while, desired to marry a daughter of the high priest. He had therefore became a proselyte and been circumcised. But since he still could not marry that sort of girl, he became angry and wrote against the circumcision and against the Sabbath and the legislation, right? So that's just a little background why you have so many scriptures on Paul writing against circumcision and the legislation of the Sabbath, because he went through all that, I guess being circumcised and trying to be an Israelite, like they said, I guess they didn't believe he was I don't know, but Benjamin still believed he was a Tarsan. One thing about the Jews and them and keeping their bloodline pure, they didn't play that. So, you can come inside the faith, you can worship, but under no means, no matter what, they still had to keep the bloodline pure. So, if you was a Gentile, you can come worship, you come have faith, you had the certain stipulations, but under no means could you have any type of intercourse or sexual relations with us. We keep our bloodline pure. Worship is cool, but anything when it comes to producing children or, intermingling the bloodline, in which we can see traces of these things in Leviticus, as far as the sheep mixing with other cattle, right? Things that echo of that kind. So that's just not how the Ebionites or the Nazarenes or the Essenes roll, right? Or, these Jews at Jerusalem, they just, again, like I said, that's just in their law, not to intermingle with Gentiles, right? As far as it goes with that. It says, but he is making completely a false accusation, this horrific serpent, but his poverty of understanding, right? For Ebion, translated from Hebrew as Greek, means poor, for truly he is poor, right? Notice how it goes back to one person, for truly he is poor. No, this is in scripture. Luke chapter 4:18, man. In understanding hope and actuality, since he regards Christ as a mere man, they regard Christ as a mere man. As a matter of fact, I'll actually read what Philip says, one of the Ebionites, in the actual text, right? Why he talks about he, right? I think it's in Luke, right? No, it's in John chapter 1. It says 43, the next day Jesus decided to go to Galilee. He found Philip and said to him, follow me. Now Philip was from Bethsaida, the city of Andrew and Peter. Philip found Nathanael and said to him, we found him, of whom Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son Joseph, right? And again, Philip is a part of the apostles. He would have been a part of that Ebionite crew, that Ebionite that poured in Luke chapter 4 and 18. I believe there's Luke 4 and 18. Let me make sure and see. Yeah, the Spirit is the Lord, right? The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he hath anointed me to preach the gospel of the poor. He hath sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to preach deliverance to the captives, and to recovering to the blind, and set liberty to them that are bruised, right? So notice he said the gospel of the poor, right? The gospel of the Ebionites, the gospel of the Hebrews, right? And then regarding the, I actually want to bring this out, right? And one of the so-called rejected scriptures, I believe, right? Gospel of Philip, right? It also goes against the virgin birth. I actually want to bring it out. It's actually funny because it actually makes a lot of sense. Pause with me for a second. Right? So let me see if I can get it. Like a long intro. Okay, here we go. Let's see, there's 30. Bear with me for a second. Hebrew makes a Hebrew. Buddha beasts, there will be many trees for food beasts. Heaven. Yo, peace and blessings, peace and blessings. The Nazarene is the one that is revealed, and that which is hidden. I ain't know it said that. Hold on. I'm gonna keep that there. I need to go see if it say that in my book. Let me do something right quick because I just want to keep that on my phone. So I just want to read what Philip says on the virgin birth. Okay. Names, the rulers. Okay, I found it on the virgin birth. So I'm gonna show it on my screen real fast for everybody that's watching. Showing on my screen. Oops, I didn't mean to do that. I don't think I got to them. Okay, let me show on my screen. Okay. Share screen, Gospel of Philip. Boom. All right. So right there on the Gospel of Philip, as you can see, what it says is the virgin birth. It says, some say that Mary received by the Holy Spirit. They're wrong. They don't know what they're saying. When did a woman ever conceive by a woman, right? He says, Mary is the virgin whom no power defiled. Is the great testimony of those Hebrews who became the first apostles and the apostolic successors. The virgin whom no power defiled, the powers defiled themselves. And the Lord wouldn't have said, my Father who is in heaven, unless he had another father. Instead, he would have simply said, my Father. The Lord said to the disciples, from every house and bring it to the Father's house, but don't steal anything from the Father's house or carry it away. See that? And then notice how it says Jesus Christ, Messiah, Nazarene, right? Jesus is a hidden name. Christ is a revealed name. So Jesus is Messiah in the Greek Christ, and all the others have it according to their own language. The Nazarene revealed what was hidden. Christ has everything within himself, whether human or angel or mystery, and the Father, right? Just showing that of the Nazarene, right? Then, of course, on the side, it gives all the gospel of Thomas, Mary, Judas, Truth, gospel of Peter, all the unknown gospel of Pyrrhus, secrets of James, right? All praises, right? A lot of things that the so-called early church fathers rejected, right? So let's go ahead and get back into it. Stop sharing, go back. Give me one in the chat if you are enjoying the presentation that I typed up, man, through the grace and spirit of the Most High. We were at Windows, I think. No. Okay. Right, now continue on. Right, those are just a lot of footnotes I have down there. Now he goes on to say, hoping to him with the poverty, they themselves, if you please, boastfully claim that they are poor because they sold their possessions in the apostles, right? We can see this in the scriptures. Time and laid them at the apostles' feet and went over to the life of the poverty and renunciation. And thus they say that they are called poor by everyone, but there is no truth to this claim of theirs either. He was really named Ebion. You see it again, right? He says, I suppose the poor wretch was named prophetically by his father and mother, right? Where we at? Where are we at? Oh, Acts chapter 2, verse 38 through 45, which shows this. Then Peter said unto them, repent and be baptized, every one of you, in the name of Jesus Christ for the remission of sins, and you shall receive the gift of the Holy Ghost. For the promises unto you and to your children and to all that are afar off, as many as the Lord our God shall call. And with many other words did he testify and exhort, saying, save yourselves from this untoward generation, right? Then he goes on to say, then they gladly received his word, were baptized in the same day. There were added unto them about 3,000 souls, and they continued steadfastly in the apostles' doctrine and fellowship, in breaking of the bread and in prayers. And fear came upon every soul, and many wonders and signs were done by the apostles. And all that believed were together and had all things in common, right? He says, and sold their possessions and goods and departed them to all men, and every man had need. And the multitude of them that believed were of one heart and of one soul. Neither said any of them that aught of these things which he possessed was his own, but they had all things in common, right? All praise. Then he goes on to say, with great power gave the apostles witness of the resurrection of the Lord Jesus. I think this is another witness, right? Am I on Acts 4? This is Acts 4. Yeah, this should be Acts 4 and 32 right here. All right. Make sure I correct that. All right. So this should be Acts 4. Acts chapter 4 says, and the multitude of them that believed were of one heart, of one soul. Neither said any of them that aught of the things which he possessed was of his own, but they had all things in common, right? And with great power gave the apostles witness of the resurrection of the Lord Jesus, and great grace was upon them all. It says, neither was amongst them that lacked, for as many as were possessors of the lands or houses of sold to them, and brought the pieces of the things that were sold, and laid them down at the apostles' feet, and distribution was made unto every man according as he had need. And Josie's, right, which is like Robert Eisman said, names start, not a lot of name playing starts to get played when it comes to these people, because Joseph is only mentioned a few times in scripture, that being by way of Jesus' brother. And here we see where Barnabas is being named, I believe, by Joseph, who by the apostle was named by Barnabas, which is being interpreted the son of consolation, a Levite of the countrymen, right? of Cyprus, right? So notice how I said the son of constellation. That's like literally Greek terminology, right? The son of the star, like some type of son of the head, like, okay. Having land, sold it and brought it the money and laid it at the apostles' feet, right? What they was talking about, what he just mentioned, the Epiphanius of Salamis, how the poor laid all their belongings and how they had everything in common and how they laid them at the apostles' feet, right? So again, the word ebion is there to throw you off from the continuation of the anti-Pauline movement, right? Acts chapter 22 and 4, right? Paul lets you know that he crucified these same people, right? He was very distinct, right? Everything that we talked about regarding the Essenes and Ebionites in his presentation, Paul knew about these people. And Paul, this is who Paul was after, right? These are the people that would not submit, right? He says, I persecuted the followers of this way unto their death, asserting both men and women, throwing them into prison, right? Acts chapter 24 and 5, right? He says, we have found this man to be a troublemaker, stirring up riots amongst the Jews all over the world. He is a ringleader of the Nazarene sect, right? And so the interesting thing about what's going on here is that it goes back to when I said that the New Testament failed to record James's death, right? James, Jesus' brother, not James, the brother of Zebedee, right? And so when you actually start to see the cover up, we actually start to put the pieces together. We actually start to read the Dead Sea Scrolls, Josephus, Hegesippus, Eusebius, all the church fathers, and whether historians, when you follow the death of James, when you follow the New Testament, you start to see where the death of James happened at, like Scarlett Sada said, and where the cover up begins, right, on Paul, right? So remember in Matthew chapter 24, verse 15 through 16, Jesus warned them that, so when you see standing in the holy place, the abomination, the causes of desolation, right? A spoken of thorough, right, through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand. He said, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains, right? So when they start to begin to see these troubles, they start to see the abomination and desolations, they're supposed to flee to the mountains, right? Well, the New Testament doesn't have them really. The New Testament has them fleeing, but at the same time, it has them coming back, and we see them back by the way of Acts chapter 15 and 21, right? So it says Acts chapter 7 and 57 through 58, right? Now we're going to run the timeline down. Acts chapter 7, verse 57 through 58. This is the stoning of Stephen and Paul, and at this they covered their ears, yelling at the top of their voices. They all rushed at him, dragged him out of the city, and began to stone him. Meanwhile, the witnesses laid their coats at the feet of a young man named Saul, right? So in Acts chapter 8, verse 1 through 4, remember, Saul approved of their killings, right? The church, now, like I said, the heading is the church persecuted and scattered, right? This is verses 2 through 4. On that day, a great persecution broke out against the church of Jerusalem, and all the aspects of the apostles were scattered throughout Judea and Samaria. Godly men buried Stephen and mourned deeply for him. But Saul began to destroy the church, going from house to house. He dragged out both men and women and put them into prisons, right? So, as you can see, that it says that the apostles were scattered, right? So that should have been the end of the Acts of the Apostles. And so when you look at the ascent of James, that's where it ends at, right? It ends at the death of James, right? And so this is where the travels of Peter, right? These other Acts of the Apostles will come in at, right? The recording. So now we go into Josephus, right, regarding the death of James, which the New Testament didn't do, right? It says, concerning Albinus under Procurator James, James was slain, as also chapter 9, 1, 22 through 24. It says, now Caesar, upon hearing the death of Festus, sent Albinus into Judea as procurator, but the king deprived Joseph of the high priesthood and bestowed the succession to that dignity on the sons of Ananus, who was also himself called Ananias. Now the report goes that the eldest Ananias approved, a most fortunate man, for he had 5 sons who had all performed the office of a high priest to God, and who himself had enjoyed that dignity a long time formerly, which had never happened to any other of our high priests. But this younger Ananias, who, as we have told you already, took the high priest, was a bold man, to temper very insolent. He was also of the sect of the Sadducees, who were very rigid in judging offenders above all the rest of the Jews, as we have already observed. When therefore Ananias, right, was of this disposition, he thought that he had now a proper opportunity to exercise his authority. Festus was now dead, and Albinus was but upon the road. So he assembled the Sanhedrin of judges and brought before them the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, whose name was James, and some others or some of his companions. And when he had formed an accusation against them as breakers of the law, he delivered them to be stoned. But as for those who seemed the most equitable of the citizens, and such as were the most uneasy as to breach of the laws, they disliked what was done. They also sent to King Agrippa, desiring him to send to Ananias that he should act as no more, for that what had already done was not to be justified. Nay, some of them went also to meet Albinus, as he was upon his journey from Alexandria, and informed him that it was not lawful for Ananias to assemble a Sanhedrin without his consent. Whereupon Albinus complied with what they said, and wrote in anger to Ananias, and threatened that he would bring him to punishment for what he had done. On which King Agrippa took the high priesthood from him, when he had ruled but 3 months, and made Jesus the son of Domitius high priest. Right. This is 4. About this time, it was the King Agrippa, right? Listen to this. About this time, it was King Agrippa built Caesarea Philippi larger than it was before, in the honor of Nero, right? So this is all within one. This now we bagging up to the end, right? We're showing Paul and Nero, right? And the New Testament, and how the New Testament failed to show, Paul's leadership in the starting of the Jewish revolt, and the temple being destroyed in 70 AD, right? So we're putting the history back inside the New Testament with Josephus and everything that we covered in the earlier presentation, right? So we're on Nero and we're on Saul, right? Because what one got to understand is, notice how the Bible, right? I told you that Greeks like to steal history. So when it comes to the Bible history, God, changes his fellow worshipers' names from whatever they were to Hebrew, I guess. So you have in the Greek translation where Paul, unfortunately, he goes from a Hebrew name, right? I'm guessing to a Greek name, a Roman name, Paul, which is pretty odd. He goes from Saul to Paul. It's kind of, or is that another attempt to hide who this Saul actually is, right? And some would say he got his name from Sergius Paulus, right? A Roman soldier, right? Written in the New Testament, right? We're not for sure that. So it says that then it was before that, in the honor of Nero, named it Neronalis, and when he had built a theater in Berytus with vast expenses, he bestowed on them shows to be exhibited every year, and spent therein many 10,000s of drachmae. He also gave the people a largesse of corn, and distributed oil amongst them, and adorned the entire city with statues of his own donation, right? And we can see that this happens today, right? Even with our presidents, right? Distributing oil amongst everybody, largesse of corn or food, right? We see these statues of these people today. Statues are erected of leaders all the time, right? And so this has been going on. This is going on even in modern times, right? Just a different system, right? Under the same system, right? And so he goes on to say that, in adorning the entire city with the statues of his own donation, with the original images made by the ancient hands. Nay, he almost transferred all that was most ornable in his own kingdom thither. This made him more than ordinarily hated by his subjects, because he took those things away that belonged to them to adorn a foreign city. And now Jesus, the son of Gamaliel, became the successor of Jesus, the son of Gnaeus, and the high priesthood, which the king had taken from the other. on which account of sedition arose between the high priests with regard to one another. For they got together bodies of the boldest sort of the people, and frequently came from reproaches to throwing of the stones at each other. But Ananias was too hard for the rest by his riches, which enabled him to gain those that were most ready to receive. Costoborus, right? Here comes Saul and Costoborus, right? Costoborus also and Saulus did themselves get together a multitude of wicked wretches, and this because they were of a royal family. And so they obtained favor amongst them because of their kindred to Agrippa, but still they used violence with the people and were very ready to plunder those that were weaker than themselves. And from that time, right, it principally came to pass that our city was greatly disordered and that all the things grew worse and worse amongst us, right? So this is Josephus talking about our city, claiming to be, remember he was supposed to be a Jew, but he traded on the Jews, saying, that they would get destroyed if they didn't listen. And so, those Jews just wasn't going. So Josephus went on the other side. I believe he fought with them or whatever, got captured by them and was able to, write these events that we hear from him today, right? And so we break down certain things from the recognitions of Clement, right? The ascents of James that we talked about earlier, right? Regarding James and his martyrdom, right? In which, remember, Epiphanius talked about when he talked about how they carry certain ascents of James or certain travels of Peter, right? Here we go. This is the recognition of 170, right? One of our enemies entering into the temple with a few men began to cry out while he was thus speaking and adding more to the same effect. And while James the bishop was refuting him, he began to excite the people and raise a tumult so that the people might not be able to bear what was said. He began to drive all into confusion with shouting and to undo what had been arranged with much labor, and at the same time to reproach the priests and to enrage them with revilings and abuse. And like a madman to recite everyone to murder, he first seizing a strong brand from the altar set the example of smiting. Then others also, seeing him, were carried away with like readiness. Then ensued a tumult on the other side of the beating, and the beaten, much blood is shed. There is a confused flight in the midst of which that enemy attacked James. And that would be Paul, right? This will be Antiquities 28 and 8. And now arose sedition between the high priest and the principal men of the multitude of Jerusalem, each of which got them of a company, right? This will be a parallel between what we just read in Recognitions 1 and 70, right? Which got them a company of the boldest sort of men and of those that loved innovation about them and became leaders to them. And when they struggled together, they did it by casting reproachful words against one another and by throwing stones also. And there was also nobody to reprove them, but these disorders were done after the licentious manner in the city, as if it had no government over it. And such was the imprudence and boldness that had seized on the high priest, that they had the hardiness to send their servants into the threshing floors to take away those tithes that were due to the priest, inasmuch that it fell out that the poorest sort of the priest died for want, right? Notice it said the poorest sort of the priest died for want. To the degree that the violence of the sedition prevail over the right and justice, right? So you heard what he said, right? To this degree, the violence of the seditions prevailed over all right and justice, right? It goes back to Acts chapter 7 and 58, where we read in Acts chapter 8, verse 1 through 4, right? So Antiquities, this is Josephus again, book 20, chapter 9, paragraph 2. He says, he, the high priest, also had servants who were very wicked, who joined themselves to the boldest sort of the people and went to the threshing floors and took away the tithes that belonged to the priest by violence, and did not refrain from beating such as would not give to the tithes to them. So the other high priests acted in like manner and did those services without one being able to prohibit them, right? And now we're going to also go in reference, right? We're going to go into things that reference, I believe, prophetic things, or things, I believe, things that may have that parallels into the death of James, right? One would be the Talmudic context, right? It's called the Pesachim 57a. It says their servants strike like people with clubs, and otherwise act inappropriately, right? So remember, we just read in the recognition of Clement how James was struck with a club, right? So in the Talmud, the Parashim, right, 57, their servants strike the people with clubs and otherwise act inappropriately. And that some of James' followers are said to be priests fit with that of Acts chapter 6 and 7 says, the number of disciples in Jerusalem increased rapidly. A large number of priests became obedient, right, to the faith, right? And so it goes on to say that that the enemy saw in recognitions 1 and 70, who began to reproach the priests and to enrage them with revilings and abuse, and like madmen to excite everyone to murder, and use a strong brand from the altar to set the example of smiting, is Paul, in that he was a servant of the high priest, as per the Talmud is clear from what follows in recognitions 1 and 71. That enemy had received a commission from Caiaphas, the chief priest, that he should arrest all who believe in Jesus and should go to Damascus with the letters, and that they're all also employing the help of the unbelievers. He should make havoc amongst the unfaithful, and that he was hastening to Damascus chiefly on this account, right? Now it says, even after this conversion, Paul remained a hothead, right? And verbally abused Cephas to his face, right? In front of them all in Galatians chapter 2, verse 11 through 14. It says, when Cephas came to Antioch, however, I opposed him to his face because he stood to be condemned. For before certain men came from James, he used to eat with the Gentiles, but when they arrived, he began to draw back and separate himself for the fear of those in the circumcision group. The other Jews joined in his hypocrisy, so that by their hypocrisy, even Barnabas was led astray, right? So he believes that Barnabas was led astray by James and Peter, right? Ironically, right? So he says, when I saw that they were not walking in line with the truth of the gospel, I said to Cephas in front of them all, right? He continued to brag about his powers in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 25 through 26. He says, everyone who competes in the games trains with a strict discipline. They do it for a crown that is perishable, but we do it for a crown that is imperishable. Therefore, I do not run aimlessly. I do not fight like a man beating the air, which kind of parallels to the enemy beating Paul with a club, right? Now we go back to the Jewish wars of Josephus, right? 556 through 584, right? He says, after this, the calamity had befallen Cestius. Many of the most eminent of the Jews swam away from the city as from the ship when it was going to sink, right? Costobarus, therefore, and Saul, who were brethren together with Philip, the son of Gesimius, who was the commander of the king Agrippa's forces, ran away from the city and went to Cestius, right? But then how Antipas, who had been besieged with them in the king's palace, but would not fly away with them, was afterwards slain by the seditious. We shall relate afterwards. However, right, Cestius sent Saul, right, this is Paul, and his friends after their own desire to Achaia, to Nero, right? Remember, Achaia was also mentioned amongst when he was talking about Apollos in Acts chapter 18, to Achaia, to Nero, to inform him of a great distress where they were in, and to lay the blame of their kindling the war upon Florus, right, as hoping to alleviate his own danger by provoking his indignation against Florus, right? So notice how it talks about Saul, right? And Costobarus, right? And then notice how it talks about a shipwreck. Well, surprisingly, Paul mentions a shipwreck, right? And the Gospels actually try to cover this shipwreck up by mentioning more than one shipwreck, right? So the shipwreck is actually mentioned in Acts chapter 27, 14 through 24. And I believe the other three are mentioned in 2 Corinthians 11 and 25. So I'm going to read 2 Corinthians 11 and 25 real fast, right? In 2 Corinthians 11 and 25, he says, thrice I was beaten with cords. Once I was stoned. Thrice I suffered shipwreck. So he says 3 times he suffered a shipwreck. A night and day I have been in the deep. So the reason for this cover up is because this shipwreck happened when Paul, I believe when Paul did what he did to James in Jerusalem and tried to escape, right? And then there's one, I believe the one that is documented that we're talking about in Josephus, would be the one in Acts chapter 27, verses 14 through 44, right? He says, but I no longer rode after there arose against, I'm sorry, he said, but not long after there arose against it a tempestuous wind called Julio-Claudian, right? A tempestuous wind. So he has a name for the wind called Julio-Claudian, right? And when the ship was caught and could not bear up into the wind, we let her drive. And running under a certain island, which is called Claudia, we had much work to come to the boat, which when they had taken up, they used helps, undergoing the ship and fearing lest they should fall into the quicksand, strake sail, and so were given. And we were being exceedingly tossed with a tempest. The next day they lightened the ship, and the third day we cast out with our own hands the tackling of the ship. And when neither sun nor stars in many days appeared, and no small tempest lay on us, all hope that we should be saved was taken away. But long absence, Paul stood forth in the midst of them and said, sirs, ye should hearken to me, loose them from the creed to have gained the harm of the lost, right? So that would be the so-called documented shipwreck, and that documented shipwreck can be seen documented in the book of Saul. Now, the other three shipwrecks are not documented, probably for the sole purpose to protect the actual character of who Saul or this Paul is in early Christianity regarding Acts chapter 1 through Acts chapter 8, 1 through 4, right? Right? So we're putting James back into the scriptures. This is what we are doing. We are putting James back into the scriptures, right? And so what it says is that it says, in the meantime, the people of Damascus, when they were informed of the destruction of the Romans, set about the slaughter of those Jews that were amongst them, and they had them already cooped up together in the place of public exercise, which they had done out of the suspicion they had of them. They thought that they should meet with no difficulty in the attempt, yet did they distrust in their own wives, which were almost all of them indicted to the Jewish religion. It says, which account it was that their greatest concern was how they might conceal these things from them. So they came upon the Jews and cut their throats, as being in a narrow place, and numbered 10,000s, and all of them unarmed. In this, in 1 hour's time, without anybody to disturb them. Right. So that might be the 10,000 saints that may be mentioned. Talked about the Jews being cut and being narrow place, and number of 10,000, all of them unarmed at this time, right? So that may be the 10,000 saints it talked about in Revelations, right? That was cut off, right? So it says, but as to those who have pursued after Cestius, when they were returned back to Jerusalem, we're still in Josephus, they overbore some of those that favored the Romans by violence, and some they persuaded by entreaties to join with them, and got together in great numbers at the temple and appointed a great many of generals for the war, right? Joseph also, the son of Gorion, and Ananias the high priest were chosen as governors of all the affairs within the city, and with a particular charge to repair the walls of the city, for they did not ordain Eleazar the son of Simon to that office, although he had gotten into the possession of the prey that they had taken from the Romans, and the money they had taken from Cestius, together with a great part of the public treasures, because they saw he was of a tyrannical temper, and that his followers were and their behavior like guards about him. Goes on to say, however, the want they were in Eleazar's money, and the subtle tricks used by him brought all so about the people were circumvented and submitted themselves into his authority in the public affairs. Oh man, we almost done. That's what's up. Okay, all praise. All right. Goes on to say, right, they also chose the other general for Idumea, right? This is important things, right? So this is the revolt, right? This is the revolt, and not everyone submitted, right? Not everyone submitted. This goes back to Romans 13, 1 Peter chapter 5. It goes back to Titus 3. There were priests. Not all the priests were down with Rome. Not all the followers in Jerusalem were down with Paul and his submission letters, right, to Nero, right? And we're gonna see this, right? It says, right, we even got people from Edom. We even got Edomites helping us fight. You hear me? They also chose other generals from Idumea, Jesus, the son of Saphias, right? Who I'm actually doing an article on right now. One of the high priests, and Eleazar, the son of Ananias, the high priest. They also enjoined Niger, the then governor of Idumea, who was of the family of the belonged to Perea, right, where a lot of Nazarenes or Essenes went. All right. Beyond the Jordan, it was thence called the Periite, that he should be obedient to those four-armed commanders, nor did they neglect the care of the other parts of the country. But Joseph, the son of Simon, who sent as general to Jericho, as was Manasseh to Perea, John, the Essenes, so as you can see, Essenes were involved, to the toparchy of Thamay. Lydia was also added to his portion in Joppa and Emmaus, but John, the son of Matthias, was made the governor of the toparchies of Gothrica and Archabitatine, as was Josephus, the son of Matthias, of both of Galilee, Gamala also, which was a strong city in those parts, was put under his command, right? All praises, right? So it says, every one of other command administered their affairs of his portion with that alarcity and prudence they were masters of. But as to Josephus, when he came into Galilee, his first care was to gain the goodwill of the people of the country, as sensible that he should thereby have a general good success, although he should fail in those other points, right? So I'm gonna just pretty much jump down some more, because, you know, we pretty much get what's going on. Like I said, this is where the Jewish war, a lot of the Jewish war starts. Shop is being set up by different commanders in different countries, right? So this pretty much goes into a lot of the Roman revolt, Jewish revolt, right? Back and forth, kidnaps and all that type of stuff, right? Just to save face time, right? It says, in order to save historical nucleus from Galatians, only the arguments along these lines, Josephus, Saul, or Paul, can work. Otherwise, the historical Paul is really lost. It's really lost forever and ever, right? The historical Paul is lost forever and ever, right? But we only have this Saul, right? It says the historical nucleus was followed. The Herodian Saul and Costoborus persecuted the insurgent Zealots, right? It says Saul and Costobor are meant behind the two demon possessed, right? So I'm going to actually show you parallels within Matthew, right? How parallels in Matthew actually fall in line with Costoboros and Saul, is how they fall in line with the two demons possessed men, right? Again, a lot of things were taken and written, right, out of Josephus's accounts and written into the Gospels, right? This is what Greeks do. It says, when he arrived at the other side of the region of the Gerasenes, two demons-possessed men coming from the tombs met him. They were so violent that no one could pass them, right? So in Matthew chapter 8:28, the Gospel of Barnabas places the swine episode in Capernaum, the same place where the Marcionite witness per excellence, who other than Paul, of course, saw the descent of Jesus from above, right? Docet, the famous Marcionite, right? It says the swine episode tradition is based on a war episode from the first Jewish rebellion, right? Only this could explain the reference to legion. We know legion is a Roman army. Some way Paul, Saul, was defeated and got his life saved. His defeat before Jesus be sufficed, and probably his flattery to save himself was interpreted as conversion, right? Makes sense, right? Taking advantage of this best knowledge of the enemy, Saul was sent by Titus as diplomatic among some leaders of the Zealots in a besieged Jerusalem. The diplomacy failed, and after the war, when Simon Goria was led by Titus in a prison of Antioch, Paul insulted him publicly before the people of Antioch. In Antioch, Paul was already preaching a crucified Christ as symbol of a new pacifist Messianism. Christianity was born, right? Many years later, Mark and Marcion, wanting to fill the holes about the things of Jesus, collected more and more possible information and heresy about the Jesus they presumed Paul was referring to. That information derived essentially from the memories about Jesus, Jesus be Saphat, right? So now, since we're at the end, let's talk about the war scrolls, right? Now it goes into what Robert Eisman was talking about as far as how the war scrolls prep them for, it shows that they were ready for this war between the sons of light and sons of darkness, and how this scroll doesn't show of a love your enemy type thing. It's more of a hate your enemy, right? And so Judas the Galilean and everyone that I just named beforehand, John the Essene, you know, everyone that band together to go against the Roman war, this would fall up under them. This sons of light, sons of darkness, Jewish war. I'm going to read some of it and we're going to end it there. This is column 1 of the war scroll from the Dead Sea Scrolls, 1QM. It says, for the instructor of the rule of war, the first attack of the sons of light shall be undertaken against the forces of the sons of darkness, the army of Belial, right? It says the army of Belial, and Paul would fall in line with the sons of darkness, or the army of Belial, right? The troops of Edom, Moab, the sons of Ammon, the Amalekites, Philistia, the troops of the Kittim of Ashur, Kittim would be Rome, supporting them that are those who have violated the covenant, the sons of Levi, the sons of Judah, the sons of Benjamin, those exiled into the wilderness. Did you hear that? Those exiled into the wilderness shall fight against them, against all their troops, with the exiles of all the sons of light returning from the wilderness of the people to camp in the wilderness of Jerusalem. Then after the battle, they shall go up from that place. And the king of Kittim shall enter into Egypt. In that time, he shall go forth with the great wrath to do battle against the kings of the north. And in his anger, he shall set out to destroy and eliminate the strength of Israel. Then there shall be a time of salvation for the people of God, and at the time of dominion of all the men of his forces, and eternal annihilation for all the forces of Belial. There shall be a great panic amongst the sons of Japheth. The Syrians shall there fall with no one to come to his aid, and the supremacy of Kittim shall seize the wickedness, be overcome without a remnant. There shall be no survivors of all the sons of darkness. The sons of righteousness shall shine to all the ends of the world, continue to shine forth until the end of the appointed seasons of darkness. Then at the time of the appointed time of God, right? Appointed time of God, his great excellence shall shine forth of all times of eternity. For peace and blessings, glory and joy, and long life for all the sons of light on the day when the Kittim, Rome, shall fall. There shall be a battle and horrible carnage, right? Before the God of Israel. For it is the day appointed by him from the ancient times as a battle of annihilation for the sons of darkness. On that day, the congregation of the gods and the congregation of men shall engage one another, resulting in great carnage. The sons of light and the forces of darkness shall fight together to show the strength of God with the roar of great multitude and the shout of gods and men, right? A day, a disaster. It is a time, a distress for all the people who are redeemed by God, and all their afflictions none exist. That is like hastening to his completion as in eternal redemption on the day of their battle against Kittim, or the Romans. Then shall they go forth for the carnage and battle, and three lots, the sons of light, which shall stand firm, so to strike a blow at the wickedness. And the three army of Belial shall strengthen themselves as to force the retreat of the forces of light. And when the banners of the infantry causes their hearts to melt, the strength of God will strengthen the hearts of the sons of light. In the seventh lot, the great hand of God shall overcome. Then it says, Belial and all the angels of his dominion and all the men of his forces shall be destroyed forever and ever. The annihilation of the sons of darkness and services to God during the war's years. These are for more fragments. The Holy One shall shine forth in support, the truth of annihilation of the sons of darkness. And then he has broken fragments of great war. They took hold of the implements of war, chiefs of the tribes and the priests, the Levites and the chiefs and the tribes, the fathers of the congregation, the priests, thus the Levites and the courses of the heads of peace and blessings. And that's hopefully, did we erase my boy? I hope we didn't erase my boy. All right. We didn't erase my boy. We'll go ahead and leave it off there with him. All right, peace and blessings. Let's get rid of that. Leave it off of my boy Robert Eisenman.
Statement, but it's surprising to see there. That's what I mean. So yeah, wow. Someone that's considered to have come out of Egypt somewhere, and someone in that environment knew that James was the successor to Jesus, and so it pops up in the Gospel of Thomas. That doesn't mean that I take every word in the Gospel of Thomas as authentic. And this is the problem. The believer is not on the level of being able to determine what is authentic and what isn't authentic. Even scholars in each other are this concern and have a very low opinion of each other in this regard. So it's an unpleasant activity to find what is authentic and what isn't authentic, and that's where common sense comes into play. So I start with even one Thomas. I'm not sure it's that I know are reliable, like the passages I told you about from Acts 21:21. It is so mind-boggling and so brutally direct that you go into the temple. That shows that he is not someone who has very deep-seated adherence to a belief system that he's going to follow absolutely if it doesn't serve his purposes. It serves his purposes here to ingratiate himself to James and appear like he's doing what a follower of James is supposed to do. But the people in the temple who know him better start shrieking and yelling, even in Acts. This is the man who teaches against us here, everywhere in Asia, and all these, and they yell and shriek, and that is an authentically accurate picture of what was going, and it creates a riot. And they take him out and throw him out, and it said, and barred the door behind him. That's actually one of the phrases in one of the scrolls, the Damascus document, I think, or the Habakkuk Pesher meaning interpretation. So these are to my mind things that really hit you hard, and are probably correct. The point being there is that they have a riot. They don't kill him, but they throw Paul out of the temple. They would have been willing to kill him because they know he's a lawbreaker. They know he's bringing non-believers who are lawbreakers into the temple, and I don't agree with them. They're not. I don't say the temple goers are nice people. I don't say that they're perfect. They're zealots. They're zealous. If I go into the temple today, religious people in the Machne Yehuda area of Jerusalem would maybe attack me. These people are zealots. Okay, they're zealots. We know what zealots are like, but that's authentic picture. But the point is that how does Paul survive? He pulls out a Roman passport, if you want, citizenship. Do you do this to Roman citizens? And then the Roman soldiers who are on watch over on the ramparts come down and rescue him and escort him, a protective escort down to Caesarea on his way to Rome. He does then appear before the governor and so on. That's all authentic material. That's authentic historical material. That is accurate. That's how he gets and save him. And he's saved because he's an Herodian, because he's got a Roman citizenship. Now, that's not my prophet. That's not my prophet. So right away, I take the Pauline corpus and set it aside. Enlightenment for me. I'm not having a Herodian teacher. I apologize. I think Herod is a monster. Herod, his ancestor. Herod did everything he could to destroy the Jewish people. Herod destroyed the Maccabean family. Herod undermined the Maccabean legacy. and the scrolls are doing everything they can, not necessarily restore the Maccabees, but to restore the legacy. So some of her Jewish background, even my rabbinic community, I mean, Christians agree with me more than my rabbinic friends, but Christians know that I'm saying something that relates to what they know too, that this James character, who is a brother of their Messiah, Lord, whatever, was a very important figure in the first century early church and came to a negative end, was martyred in some way, and so on and so forth. And he was turned over by the rabbinate and the Herodian priestly establishment for stoning, supposedly. You know why? And this is so crazy, because he apparently went into the inner sanctum of the temple. I think it's in Josephus. Went into the inner sanctum of the temple, which only the high priest on Yom Kippur was supposed to do, and asked forgiveness on the part of the whole people, so that he was considered by the opposition Sadducees as the authentic high priest. And that, to me, starts to make so much sense. I know to the average person, but it makes so much sense that it helps my sense of history. The thing is, that's why they're attracted to my work, because it's meaningful to them, whereas to the average Jew doesn't know what I'm talking about. Doesn't know what I'm talking about. The average Jew, believes in the Gospels more than the average Christian. Not as salvationary documents. You say, oh, well, this information's been around for 2,000 years. It must be correct. What's there to question here? I know they don't even question it. No, that's the way it was. Well, no, we don't like him because he's obviously not one of us, and so on and so forth. They don't even know. They haven't gotten to the level of being able to question the material in a historical manner. Version of that we now accept as Christianity came down through these various stages of the Roman Empire into the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, up to the present time, and the literature of Christianity is become something that is widely accepted, but the behavior patterns of the peoples who have accepted this literary expression are totally unchristian, because the Christian nations, if we can call them that, are some of the most warlike nations in the world. They've been fighting wars ever since Roman times, and by the time of our own time, the 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries, we've had some of the most terrible wars imaginable between and among Christian nations. Different kinds of Christian nations, Orthodox maybe, and so on, but still Christian nations, and believing Christians fighting these wars. So the documents of love your enemy and all this sort of thing are not exemplified in their behavior patterns. So what should one look for if one is looking for a salvationary doctrine? I mean, the doctrine is fine, but nobody follows. I have nothing against some of the ideas expressed. They're very beautiful. And I come down to the idea of righteousness. Righteousness. The scrolls are interested in righteousness. Now, we may not agree with their view of righteousness. I think mostly they felt righteousness had to do with following the law of Moses. I'm not a big advocate of the law of Moses. I don't I don't believe in a necessarily a priesthood descended from Aaron. As long as one sticks to ethical things like the 10 Commandments, as long as one sticks to certain areas of it that are quite high flying, like you mentioned, quite people and Chang and Amos and people of that stature in the scripture. I mean, the kings from David on down to the prophets aren't very, after Solomon, aren't very inspiring. So, I mean, that's a literature of a people. You're not supposed to, identify with every single bit of it. But the righteousness idea, I think, is the central core of what is being aimed at. And I think that's in the prophets. I think it's in the Dead Sea Scrolls. I think it's in everyone's heart. So if you want me to say finally what I think it comes down to, I think people have an intuitive understanding of what righteousness is. If I see a little boy, a crippled boy, let's say, and a man over here making fun of him or persecuting him or tormenting him, my heart automatically reacts against that. And I know that's unrighteous, that is not right, that is not good. And I have an inner sense of right and good. It doesn't come from any scripture. It doesn't come from any teaching. It's in my soul. And I think people know in their soul what is right. Maybe not every right and wrong, whether you should sleep with a man or sleep with a woman or have a mistress or not have a mistress, or these kinds of sexual things, which are very complicated, which everyone has a different approach to depending on what's being written. I can't comment on that. But on the general things of what is right and how one should behave in a righteous way, treating one's children in a just manner, treating one's neighbor in a just manner, not cheating someone in business or in things that, all these kinds of things I think are clear. And like I think the American Civil War, freeing people from slavery, I think people understood that was a righteous thing to do. I don't think necessarily the outcome of the Civil War was a righteous outcome. I don't think that the fact that Lincoln was shot and so on did not undermine what the values of the war were being fought for. I think, in fact, the assassination of Lincoln destroyed what was being fought for, and we ended up with the same and worse problems as we had before for another 100 years. So, I mean, people recognize what is righteous, and that's what I would advocate. And that's why I think we have a person in the scroll documents called the teacher of righteousness. At the literary thing. Someone wrote that in a literary document.
You're right. It said doctrine based on literature.
You see, you have literary documents where this kind of thing is expressed. You have the Gospels where these things are expressed in a literary form. Yeah. What you just said about Abraham is expressed in a literary form. Did this actually happen? That is the question. My mind, I don't know if these things actually happen like that, or if that's just an idea of a writer in the Davidic monarchy period, his idea of a way of putting things, of making this Abraham a real historical character in the way we make Jesus a real historical character in the Gospels. Well, the scroll documents don't usually tell stories about anyone. They've already got the old biblical stories that they've already copied, and they obviously value them and consider them very holy or sacred or important. But in their individual writings themselves, they do write about things happening in their time and things that happened to the righteous teacher, and the righteous teacher is obviously killed by somebody, it seems, and so on and so forth. And those things you can put in an historical context. My argument with the people who like to date the scrolls in the 2nd century BC and the 1st century BC is that would make the scrolls anti-Maccabean. But unfortunately, the scrolls are, because they're anti-establishment, the scrolls unfortunately have everything in common with the Maccabean mindset and nothing against them. The ideology, the form of expression of the scrolls have everything to do with the end of the 1st century BC and the 1st century AD. In other words, the coming of the Romans, imposition of the Herodian dynasty, and the final war against the Romans. And I think what we have there is the literature of this final war against the Romans. Not that it was all written at that time, but the literature that led up to it, including John the Baptist type of material. We have a presentation of material that certainly is contemporary with who the New Testament calls John the Baptist, or Josephus originally spoke about him. And I would say John the Baptist was either a partisan of the scrolls or a kindred spirit out in the wilderness to the scrolls people, because he was out where the scrolls were surely together in the Qumran area, which is right near some of the areas we associate with John the Baptist, and where he was, and of course across I've been over there in Jordan, in Machaerus, where he supposedly was killed. And obviously those areas had a lot of interest to the writers of the scrolls. They lived in those areas, they settled in those areas. And don't forget, the scroll material was ultimately also found on Masada. Now, Masada is a place where everyone committed suicide. Families, children, wives, rather than surrender to Rome. Rather than surrender to Rome and give their children or wives as Roman servants or mistresses or slaves. They preferred death. And to my mind, this is the mindset of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And what do you know? Some scrolls were found there. And what do you know in addition? Immersion pools as well. But in addition, we have a Roman historian of the second, third century, Hippolytus, that tells us there were 4 kinds of Essenes. And the last 2 kinds of Essenes are not the kind our scholars love to seize upon as being the scroll writers. And if you look upon the Essenes that Josephus describes, they're nothing like the scrolls that if you read them, but they are what he calls zealot Essenes and Sicari Essenes. Oh, well, that's mind-blowing. Hippolytus says there were 2 groups that were called zealot Essenes or Sicari Essenes. Well, the zealots we just heard about in that Acts passage raised the war against Rome. Josephus tells you all about them. But what about the Sicari? Who were the Sicari? Josephus tells us that too. We know that the Sicari are named after the Roman word for knife, sica, which they held sort of like the Arabs did, that curved dagger that continued into Arab times in their on their breast or whatever, that they held under a shirt on their breast or somewhere. And therefore they were known as Sicari because they had the curved dagger. But they didn't use the curved dagger as decoration. These people in Palestine who had the dagger were assassinating Herodian satraps, Herodian, sympathizer type people, traitors. They were, and it's all in Josephus. They were killing people who were betraying the Jewish historical heritage, and preparing to live under Roman Herodian dominance. And therefore Josephus hates them. He calls them Sicari. But Hippolytus says they're Sicari Essenes. And we hear that the final withdrawal place in the war against Rome caused by the Zealots, the last most extreme party were the Sicari. And guess what? They withdrew to Masada. Josephus tells us he knows he was there. And he escaped somehow. But the point, no, he was with the Romans anyway. And he witnessed the mass suicide there. And he said, the Sicari committed suicide there. Who were these Sicari Essenes? Sicari Essenes are actually the authors of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Zealot, Sicari Essenes, and zealot Christians, in the sense that we are all zealots here of the Jamesian community. I'm not trying to say that they're warlike. They're only warlike in the sense they're not prepared to surrender to the brutality of the Roman Empire and give their children over to Roman slavery, to being raped by Roman soldiers, to being kept as basic chattel and whores by Roman soldiery or officials and so on and so forth. They weren't prepared for this. They would rather fight and they would rather kill their offspring. You have to respect them. I mean, I wouldn't want to be in their position. They were extremely brave. They were just of the extreme righteousness, and they were prepared to go to the final degree. Some escaped. That's the crazy thing. In the scrolls, it speaks of the camps, the wilderness camps in the land of Damascus. That's in the Damascus document. There are wilderness camps. It speaks. Why do we need wilderness camps? We know about going into the wilderness in the gospel literature. We need wilderness camps because the people preparing for the final apocalyptic war against all evil on the earth, they can't be married. Because marriage brings all kinds of other issues, sin and different kinds of things like that. They have to be perfectly pure. And the reason they have to be perfectly pure, they have to immerse themselves, they have to baptize themselves, they have to be daily bathers, they have to go and be purified every single day, because the camps must be perfectly pure. And why? Because they know they can't win this war with the few people that they have. They need the heavenly host. And we don't understand that for them, the heavenly host are the warrior angels. That the heavenly host is a force like 100 atomic bombs. And I see there's something beyond these people were very creative. They understood the heavenly host. And they may have been nuts, and we would say, what stupid people, they believe this nonsense? Yes, they believed it to the point of death. They believed it. They went to these camps. And so some of these camps out in the wilderness in Syria and northern Iraq survived. And we get remnants of them all into the Arabian Peninsula. Some of them actually, a few survived, I think, into Muhammad's time and became teachers of him in caves. Don't forget, Muhammad is learning his doctrine on the caravan trade from Mesopotamia to Mecca, but he's also studying in caves. There are teachers in these caves. The scroll people are always in caves. The point being, I'm not trying to make superficial parallelisms, but there were teachers who were teaching him, and the teaching is very similar to what we have in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And Islam has a lot of material in common with the Dead Sea Scrolls. Not in common with Judaism, not in common with Christianity, more like an extreme apocalyptic militanism. And yes, they are, aren't they? The Muslims are extreme apocalyptic militants. Yeah. And by the way, this baptism is only an initiation in the Christian view of it.
That's correct.
It's for the Essenes, these different groups. It's a constant daily routine of keeping purification. So you may have to start by being purified, but then you must keep it up and keep it up and keep it up and keep it up. But the reason you're keeping it up is because you are preparing for the coming of the heavenly host among you. See, the heavenly host as they saw it, and they may have been nuts, okay, but they were creatively nuts. I think it's very, 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 very beautiful. I don't believe it necessarily, but the heavenly host, as they saw it, could not abide human impurity, or they could not go back up to heaven. To be in heaven, they had to be totally pure. So if they came down to earth and stood alongside human beings to help them and be with them, there couldn't be any pollution or impurity in the camp with them. It had to be perfectly pure, and that's what these wilderness camps were. It's an incredibly beautiful, if you like Christianity, it's also just like that. It's an incredibly beautiful picture of the universe that we underestimate tremendously. Before that, some came from James. That's I guess Peter here. He ate with Gentiles, kept table fellowship, but when the people from James came, he withdrew and separated himself, fearing them which were of the circumcision. And the other Jews assembled likewise with him. Even Barnabas was carried away with this unfortunate behavior. When I saw that they walked not uprightly according to the truth of the gospel, I said unto Peter, if you, being a Jew, livest after the manner of Gentiles and not as do the Jews, why compels other Gentiles to live as Jews do? And so on and so forth. And and knowing blah, 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 blah. So then he goes on his lecture to Peter. But the point is that he says to that's the sum from James. That's the important things. They were eating overseas with, I'm not saying this is nice, with Gentiles, but they separated themselves from eating with them because they realized that that was not, these people were not clean, and therefore they couldn't keep table fellowship with them. I know it sounds racist, but the point has to do with purity.
Purity, and in their perspective, though, it seems like purity also has to do with righteousness.
Oh well,
and so when we say,
but I think purity is part of righteousness, but not in the big sense that you and I would think, oh, take a bath or something.
Yeah.
Their purity is extreme because of the holy angel part of it. Right. It'd have to be absolutely pure. You know, you and I we don't expect the angels to join our camps, so we don't go around trying to be absolutely pure. But they're waiting for this final. I know it's nuts, but they're waiting for this final apocalyptic war. I know it's nuts.
And it seems like Jesus was teaching about apocalyptic.
Jesus is part of this group.
Yeah.
I don't have any doubt of that, but that doesn't mean it's true what I think.
No. But it just shows the relationship. And I think in the relationship of what he's describing, he's saying it's going to happen in your lifetimes. He's telling, as far as what we have in the literature of the Gospels.
Well, it did happen, and they lost.
Right. So,
but I said some of these groups survive, so we get groups in northern Syria and Arabia and other places getting spin-offs, and we finally get all these other strange movements developing in these other, and Islam is the last of these movements. Well, these things, 40 days in the wilderness, I think, is more of a biblical event that has been drawn upon to explain things that they think they should be doing, because these scroll type communities or camps or environments were basically in the wilderness. I don't think it had to do with 40 days or not 40 days. But in a writer who's in Rome or who's creating a different literature, then going out in the wilderness is like spending 40 days in the wilderness. That's in the Bible, for instance. It's a biblical, I forget who it was that it relates to 40 days. It has to do with a biblical event, so they're imitating that. I would like to say, though, and I haven't said, the difference between the history and literature as such. You see, let us say that the Gospels, attractive as they are, full of ideas that are, well, they're supposed to attract us. That's the whole point of them. Ideas that are surprising, but also ingratiating to us. We like the idea of loving everybody, even though we don't. We wish we could love our enemy, even though we don't. And things like that. They're surprising ideas, but interesting ideas and things like that. There's more than that, obviously. But to my mind, the Gospels are, as I said at the beginning of our discussion together, the Gospels are a Greco-Roman or Hellenistic literature. They're created purposefully to be propagated in a Greco-Roman Hellenistic environment. The messianic leader or teacher or Messiah persona is a person who evinces these ideals that are attractive to such an environment mindset, already been prepared for it by the Plato and Aristotle type heritage that they have. So these are attractive things, but to my mind, all of that is in the area of literature. And as I said earlier, literature is not history. Literature can be anyone, the person who writes it wants it to be, and he can change it, remodel it, fashion it, like a sculptor would. History is very complicated, very hard to understand. And therefore, it's difficult to make a religion out of history. But dealing with the Gospels and the scrolls is like dealing with religion, with history and religion. You know, I don't think that the Gospels are history as such. They're more literature. I don't take everything Homer says in the Odyssey as pure history. It may be based on some historical material, but, you know, or even the Iliad or these things that have become famous, Dante's Divine Comedy or whatever. That's all in the realm, Cervantes, type of literature. That's all in the realm of classic literature, as I put the Gospels. To me, history is tough stuff. And when you work on the scrolls, you're working in the area of tough stuff. And you have to be extremely uncommitted. You have to be extremely not sensitive. You can't worry about whether your feelings are being bruised or not. You have to deal with the material as you have it in front of you. And that's what studying the scrolls demands. And that's why I think so few have done it in any kind of successful way. And those who have done it fairly well are ostracized by all the ones who just do it in the ordinary way and say, oh, these would be Christianity, except they don't have this. They don't look like this. In other words, the people who keep saying, we know what Christianity is, but the scrolls, okay, we can clearly see that though they have some messianic ideas, they're nothing like Christianity. No, they're not, because they're Aboriginal Christianity. They're what Christianity was in Palestine before it went overseas. Well, I don't know what faith is. And I can't comment on what people leave that I don't understand to begin with. But I can say that, to my mind, as I said earlier, the only faith I have is in the concept of righteousness. If what you are doing makes you into a more righteous person, that's fine as far as I'm concerned. To my mind, God, if you want to speak in such terms, that it makes one demand on people to be righteous. It doesn't tell you to believe this, believe that, believe on Jesus and you will be saved, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Believe on Moses and you will be saved, believe on Muhammad, whatever. No, just be righteous. That doesn't mean you're going to be saved, because I don't even know if there is such a thing as salvation. Can't say that. I'm just saying we live in this world, and I know what high behavior is, and I know what low behavior is. And I think it is better to behave in a high manner than in a low manner. And I think one feels better. The only problem is economically, this might not bring the advantages behaving in a low manner brings. So people are tempted in many ways to go and do things that they might not wish to do otherwise. I can't help the economic factors of behaving in a high manner. I choose, as far as possible, to behave in the highest manner I can conceivably behave in. And that's what I think is people are called upon to do. And I don't think there's any book that tells me how to do it. It's in my and your soul. You know how to do it. So the literature can be attractive. If it helps you do that, fine. But don't tell me that that's history, because I don't believe in an Herodian view of history. And I don't believe anything an Herodian Paul has to tell me, because to me, the Herodian family, I mean, I'm a Jewish background. I don't like all Jews. My kids keep coming, oh, I don't like this Jew, I don't like that Jew. They're not such great people. I didn't say they're great people, but that's my background. That's my background. I can't deny my background. Okay, they're not all perfect. No one's all perfect. But, I can't believe or follow someone I know did everything they could to destroy the Jewish people. I can't believe in Hitler. And I can't believe in anyone like a Herod descendant who does these things. Like, for instance, I condemn everyone from my people who goes and kisses the Wailing Wall. Why? Because they don't know it. That's not their fault that they're ignorant. That is the wall of the Herodian temple. That is the wall that Herod built to ingratiate himself with the people. No, I will not kiss an Herodian wall. I will build a proper wall of a Jewish temple if you want to build a temple, but I'm not going to kiss an Herodian wall, and I'm not going to pray. I know they're in their soul, they're trying to be righteous, they're praying because they want the temple to come back and they think this is a holy place. Okay, he put a wall around, okay, so it's not so bad, shall we say. But the wall itself, I know what that represents. I can't explain that to my own people. So I would condemn my own people for this, for sure. So I don't agree with them, and I have, I think, many more things in common with evangelical Christians. But the point of the matter is that this Herodian monstrosity, whichever side it came from, I will not follow. Well, the thing is about the wall and kissing and this, their sentiment is good and pure. And it just, if they were taught a little more depth, if they were taught in a little more depth, then maybe this sentiment would come out in the feeling of the need to actually build a wall that was a righteous thing that they could respect. In the meantime, well, what they're doing is passable, but to my mind is somewhat unacceptable in the sense that I know who constructed it and why. And so, unfortunately, maybe knowing history is a bad thing. You know too much for your own good.
That's true.